wouldn't have happened. But when someone's out like torturing you in a malevolent way, or maybe you're doing the same, you can always ask yourself, well, is this really necessary? Is this just like a useless add-on to the miseries of life? That's what disheartens people. And so even in your own life, if you aren't suffering from self-imposed misery, and you're only suffering from inescapable misery, maybe you could handle that, and you know, you could survive, you could bear it, and even maybe without becoming irredeemably corrupt. So the goal would be, well, yeah, life is a rat's nest of miseries, and maybe it has no ultimate meaning. We could say that if we're feeling particularly pessimistic, but it still leaves one question open, which is, if you didn't do everything you could to make it worse, how good could you make it be? And the least answer is, well, it could be tragedy, but maybe not hell. And I think that's right. I really believe that. That's the most pessimistic, proper statement. The worst case outcome in the worst of all possible worlds is that your life could be tragic, but not hell. And that's a lot better than hell, right? And you think, I could give you an example of the difference. You're at your mother's deathbed. Well, that's tragedy. Here's another scenario. You're at your mother's deathbed, and all you and all your idiot siblings are arguing. Well, that's the difference between tragedy and hell. And you might be able to tolerate the first circumstance, and maybe it would even bring you closer together with your family members. The second one, no one can bear that. You walk away from a situation like that, sick of yourself and sick of everything else too. And you know, it's often the case that tragic circumstances bring out the dragons, because the stress is high and all those things that people haven't dealt with, they don't have the energy to repress, and all the bitterness comes pouring forward. It's like, let's go. Seriously, man. You know, so that's actually it's a rough lesson, but it's a good hallmark for figuring out whether or not you've got yourself adjusted properly and in relationship to your siblings. It's like, if you were all gathered around the bed of someone close who is dying, could you manage it? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, put your life together, because it's going to happen. And you should be the person who's there that can do it, and do it properly. And then maybe you'd find that it isn't the sort of thing that will undermine your faith in life itself. And I've seen both of those situations, you know, ugly situations, murderously ugly situations, and then they're opposite, where people have had terrible things happen to them as a family, and you know, they pull together and they rebuild their damn ship and they sail away. So that seems to me to be a lot better. That makes you Noah when the flood comes, right? Well, okay, so the same thing. Question emerges. Well, who are you? Well, you could say, this plan. That's how people usually identify. Maybe they have no plan at all and they're just in chaos. Right? That's like being in the belly of the beast. They're nihilistic in chaos. They have no plan. They're just chaos itself. And that's a very dreadful situation for people to be in. Or maybe they conjure together a plan. That's their identity. It's kind of fragile, and they're holding on to that with everything they've got. It's a little stick of wood that they're floating in the ocean, clinging to. You know, and so they're identifying really hard with that plan. That's what happens when you're an ideologue, is that you're identifying really hard with that plan. The problem is, if something comes up and you confront it, you can't let go of the plan, because you drown. And you cling to it rigidly. Well, that's no good, because then you can't learn anything. And then if that's you, you're a totalitarian, you're not going to learn anything. You're going to end up in something that's close enough to hell so that you won't know the difference, and you might drag everyone along with you. And that's happened plenty of times. Right? It's the whole story of the 20th century. It happened over and over and over. And it happens in people's states, it happens in their business organizations, it happens in their cities, it happens in their provinces, it happens in their states, and it happens in their psyches, all at the same time. You can't blame the manifestation of that sort of thing on any of those one levels. It happens when a society goes down that way, it goes down everywhere at the same time. It's not the totalitarians at the top and all the happy people striving to be free at the bottom. It's not that at all. It's totalitarianism at every single level of the hierarchy, including the psychological. And so you don't want to be the thing, you don't want to be in chaos, that's for sure, but you don't want to be the thing that clings so desperately to the raft that you can't let go when someone comes to rescue you, right? You don't want to be that. So then you think, well, exactly what are you? You're not the chaos, you're not the plan. Maybe you're the thing that confronts the obstacle. And I would say that's the categorical lesson of psychology insofar as it has to do with personal transformation. That's what you always teach people in psychotherapy. I don't care what sort of psychotherapist you are. You're always teaching people the same thing. You're the thing that can, you're not the plan. You're the thing that can confront the obstacle to the plan. And then when you know even further that the obstacle is not only an obstacle, but opportunity itself, so then your whole view of the world can change. Because you might think, well, I've got this plan, something came up to object to it. It's like, it's possible that the thing that's objecting has something to teach you that will take you to the place where you develop an even better plan. That's a nice framework to use. It's like, are you so sure that this is a problem? Is that the only way that you can look at it? Or is it an opportunity? I mean, I'm not trying to be, you know, naively optimistic. There are some things that's pretty hard to extract gold from some dragons, and maybe the death of a family member is a good example of that. But even in a situation like that, I can tell you that it's an opportunity for maturation, that's for sure. And the thing is, you might say, well, it's pretty miserable to be digging for gold when someone's falling into the grave. Well, if they really love you, first of all, that's what they'll want you to do. And second, you're going to make their death a lot more palatable experience for them. If you're someone who can be in the room and be helpful instead of be, you know, quivering in the corner and feeling that the entire world is collapsing in on you. I mean, that's another. You want to be the useful person at the funeral. How's that for a goal? That's a good goal, man. You know that you've got yourself together in a situation like that because you're going to be at them. And maybe you want to be the person on whose shoulder people cry. That'd be a good goal. It's kind of, you know, I don't like being naively optimistic, so when I tell you to get your life together, I'm not going to say roses and sunshine. It's like, that's pablum for a fool. But it really is something to be the reliable person at a funeral. And what are these dimensions exactly? Well, you could think about them as, I think of them as sub-personalities. But here's some other ways of thinking about them, if you want to flesh this out a little bit. You could think of them as a frame of reference, so that if you're an extrovert, I was going to tell you the extroverted question. Does being around groups of people make you energetic, or does it exhaust you? And if you're the sort of person that, you know, will go to a party and interact with 20 people, and then you have to go home and be by yourself for like 2 weeks, then you're introverted. Introverts are exhausted by social interactions. Extroverts are the opposite. They're energized by social interactions. And you know, you might be in the middle, so that you can take it or leave it with regards to social interactions, but you're happy to go to them and you're happy to spend time by yourself. But a real extrovert, there'll be some of you in here. How many of you can't stand spending time alone? Few people admit it. Extroverts are more likely to admit that sort of thing too, by the way. And how many of you like to spend time alone, or would rather be alone? Okay, so there's a preponderance of introverts in this class, by all appearances. But that's a pretty canonical question for extroversion versus introversion. It's a very stable trait, by the way. It manifests itself early in life, and it's stable across the age span. Not completely. Introverts can learn to be extroverted, and the extroverts can learn to spend time on their own. I think that actually your capacity to expand your ability past the initial constraints of your biological temperament is something like the development of character or wisdom. You know, so if you're an introvert by nature and you learn how to be extroverted, then that expands your domain of competence. And if you're extroverted, you learn to be introverted, the same thing. But it's almost like, imagine a distribution of introversion here, extroversion here, a normal distribution. You're set, when you're young, at somewhere along that distribution with some range around it. And I think what you do as you mature, if you develop your skills, is you expand that range, but your set place at which you're set doesn't move that much. So, okay, so you can think about them as sub-personalities. You can think about them as frames of reference. So frame of reference would be something like, well, since you're extroverted, you value being with people. And so you're going to look at the world. For example, if you're extroverted, you come into a room like this, you think, oh, look, it's a whole field of opportunity for social interactions. And if you're introverted, you think, well, maybe I'll go sit up in the corner and hope everybody leaves me the hell alone. But so it's an a priori set of perceptual structures that you bring to bear on a whole sequence of environments. So, for example, maybe you're high in openness versus low in openness. That's the creativity dimension. People who are high in openness tend to be artists and entrepreneurs. And open people will look at other people as opportunities to engage in interesting intellectual conversations. So you can tell when you're talking to someone open, especially if they're very high in openness, because they're going to want to talk to you about ideas or about aesthetics. It's going to go right away. So that's how they view you, as a source of that sort of conversation. That's how they view the landscape. Someone who's high in neuroticism, which is a negative emotion dimension, is more likely to view the world as a place of threats to be protected against, because they're more anxious and more prone to emotional pain. So anyway, so that's the frame of reference issue. So there's something about your underlying fundamental psychological traits that determine, or influence at least, your value structures, and they do it at the level of perception. They also tend to set your goals. So extroverted people have as one goal the opportunity to engage with other people. So extroverts love parties. They live for parties. They love to tell jokes as well. That's a very good behavioral marker of extroversion. And so, because they value those sorts of things, they set them as goals in their life. Or you could say the extroversion operating within them sets them as goals within their life, depending on how deterministic you want to be about it. So, their patterns of behavior, that's another, at a micro level. You know, I showed you that sort of hierarchy of value / frames of references that range from micro behaviors up to high order abstractions. You can extract out personality by looking at people's micro actions as well. And one of the papers that I want you guys to read that's on the course website has to do with our investigation into behavioral markers of the big 5 traits. Yeah. Maybe. We don't know exactly. I'll get back to that. At the moment, that's kind of what it looks like. Introversion is something like the absence of extroversion. But let me explain extroversion more particularly. It'll make more sense. Okay. All right, so you can think about them as stable motivations. So, for example, people who are high in agreeableness, I can generally tell people who are high in agreeableness when they come into my clinical practice and I start asking them about their biography. Because my experience has been that people who are agreeable will tell you their biography defined by relationships they've had over their life. So agreeable people are high in compassion and high in politeness. It looks like the maternal dimension. It looks like the pair bonding dimension, something like that. And so agreeable people tend to characterize their lives in terms of the intimate relationships they've had. And so those are also people who would value an intimate relationship over anything else. Agreeableness is the uppermost trait that characterizes their personality. Then, well, systems of values, we already talked about that a little bit. The higher you are in a given trait, the more you value certain opportunities that are associated with that trait. And so I think it's worthwhile thinking about traits along using all of those different conceptual schemes to understand what constitutes a trait. But what people are, in some sense, is a little melody of traits. Melody, not M-A-L-A-D-Y, although some people are like that, but melody like a song, you know, where different amounts of each of the canonical traits operate to a different degree at each person, and the person that manifests themselves is the panoply of those traits as they manifest themselves in the world. And so it's actually very useful to understand your big 5 traits as far as I'm concerned. Actually, that's why I have you do that exercise that you're supposed to do for this class. That helps you identify your faults and virtues. And I use big 5 terminology to help you do that. So part of the reason it's useful to know what your traits are is because it can help you figure out how you should orient your life. So for example, if you're high in extroversion, you know, you've got a proclivity towards sales, for example. And you're going to like occupations where you have a lot of opportunity for social interactions and social networking. You're not going to be happy if your job requires you to sit alone for extended periods of time and work in the absence of social interaction. You're going to be one of those annoying people then in one of those offices that instead of sitting alone in their offices, going from doorway to doorway, engaging everyone in conversation, right? So, and you want to be in a position that capitalizes on your traits, because it's really difficult to work contrary to your traits. The other thing that's worth thinking about too is we're actually building a computer app for this, which has been about 80% done for a whole year. You've got a hypothesis that we're still working out that's supported to some degree by the relevant literature. So imagine that you're looking for a stable partner, right? So you might think, well, what do you want in a stable partner? And at least in principle, one of the things you don't want is too much mismatch between you and that person on the 5 fundamental dimensions. So for example, if you're really extroverted and you have a really introverted partner, you're going to engage in continual conflict about how much social activity the two of you should subject yourself to. And it's very, very difficult for people who are broadly different, widely different on those dimensions to come to consensus, because it's not just a matter of opinion, right? It's really a matter of different, if you're looking at extremes, of really different types of people. And the thing about introverts is they just don't enjoy large-scale social interaction that much. One-on-one they're often fine, but in a group they don't like that, and it tires them out. Whereas a real extrovert, it's like you isolate them and they just wither on the vine, because a huge part of what actually motivates them in a positive way is tangled up with social interaction. And so if you're an agreeable person and you have a particularly disagreeable partner, you're also going to run into problems, because the agreeable person will say whatever you want whenever, and the disagreeable person will say, well, I'd like to know what the hell you want for a change, and be much more harsh and much more demanding in the situation. And the agreeable person is going to find the disagreeable person harsh and unpleasant, and the disagreeable person is going to find the agreeable person wishy-washy and unable to stand up for themselves. And again, that's actually one of the primary sources of tension between men and women, because women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men. It's about half a standard deviation, which is quite a large difference by psychological standards. And so what that means, I probably haven't got this statistic quite right, but I think I've got it about right. What that means fundamentally, just so you have some sense of how large an effect that is that if you have a group of men and women and you pick out random pairs, the woman is going to be more agreeable than the man 60% of the time. So that's not an overwhelming proportion, but it's reliable, and it's quite large by psychological standards. So there's the problem with agreeableness. With conscientiousness, well, if you're conscientious, you're industrious and orderly. And orderly people seem to be sensitive to disgust, which is something we'll talk about in detail later. We've had a hard time specifying exactly what makes industrious people industrious, because it's hard to come up with an animal model for that sort of thing. There's no theoretical model. But our latest idea is that, it's not my idea, it's actually the idea of my graduate student, Christine Brophy, is that industrious people find it unpleasant and unsettling to not be doing something. So it isn't so much that industriousness makes them happy or fills them with positive emotion. That would be more extroversion, right? Because extroversion is the positive emotion dimension. It's that industrious people can't stand sitting around doing nothing. And you know, this is speculation, but you know, human beings are obviously always engaged in the exchange of labor, especially the reciprocal exchange of labor. And you can imagine that in a community where everyone knows everyone, the people who work hard are going to be pretty irritated on a fairly chronic basis with the people who are completely unproductive. And my suspicions are that plenty of people who were completely unproductive in the history of the evolution of our species were wiped out by people who were unhappy with their lack of productivity. And so I think, generally speaking, human beings have this sense of ethical obligation with regards to one another to share labor. And people who are conscientious really, really feel that. So they feel bad if they're not busily working on something that's productive all the time. And so the advantage to being with someone conscientious is, well, they're going to work like mad. But the disadvantage is they're going to work like mad. So, you know, if you're looking for a partner that you want to relax with or have fun with, or who isn't uptight, then a conscientious person is probably not a very good choice. On the other hand, if you're a conscientious person and you're living with someone who's really unconscientious, that's good, because they might be able to help you relax, but you're not going to be happy with them because they don't work nearly as hard as you do. But even worse, on the orderly dimension, you know, some of you have had roommates and maybe you're more orderly than your roommate. What does it mean? It means you're annoyed by mess before they are. And you don't have to be annoyed by mess much before your less orderly roommate for you to be the one that's always running around picking things up. And so actually, one of the things that's emerged from the psychometric analysis is that women are slightly more orderly than men. And I suspect that has something to do with the, what would you call it, inequitable distribution of housework. Because even if imagine that your proclivity is to be triggered by disorder 25 seconds before your partner's. Well, you're going to end up, it doesn't take much difference for you to be the one that's always concerned about the mess first. So anyways, and so if you're a really orderly person and you live with a disorderly person, well, good luck getting along with them. They're going to regard you as like uptight and over concerned with details and unwilling to relax, that's for sure. And they're going to regard you as, well, how can anyone possibly live with someone like you? And so another reason why it's useful to understand your personality is because I think it gives you a better crack at finding someone that you can actually live with over the long run. And we don't know what the optimal, I don't think you want to live with someone who's exactly like you, because then both of you have the same strengths and weaknesses, and there's a bit of a problem there, right? Because maybe an agreeable person can use a bit of a disagreeable person around them to balance each other out, and vice versa, right? So we don't understand the optimal balance for long-term thriving in a relationship, but I think we do understand the fact that if you're too different in your traits, that where you're different is going to constitute a chronic source of conflict. So anyway, so you can think about that. So, all right, so how have psychologists studied personality? Well, I'm going to talk most about the statistical psychometric approach to begin with, but there are other approaches that we will talk about as well. Let me give you the background on the self-report methodology first, because it's really formed the backbone of psychological research into personality. So imagine that you took a comprehensive sample of all the descriptive adjectives in the English language. Now, it's trickier than you think, because actually what constitutes an adjective isn't that easy to determine, because many words have forms that are adjective, verb, and noun, depending on how the same word is written out. So distinguishing adjectives from verbs or adverbs turns out to be more difficult than you might think. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you could collect all of the descriptive adjectives in the English language, and that then perhaps you decided, because you don't want to use all of them, you decided that you were going to use the most common 1,000 of them. And there are tables that enable you to look up the frequency of words. And it turns out that in common parlance, it's like 5% of the vocabulary of English language accounts for 95% of the usage. It's an example of this phenomenon called the Pareto distribution, which we will talk about later. So, in fact, most discourse is done with 500 words. You get about 80%, something like that, of speech in terms of single word comprehension with 500 words. So let's say you took the 1,000, you took all the descriptive adjectives, and then you took the ones that were the most common 1,000. And so here's the hypothesis part. And this is a critical thing to know. This is called the linguistic hypothesis. And the linguistic hypothesis is that variation in personality among human beings is of sufficient import so that it's become accurately coded in the lexicon. So what that means is that, roughly speaking, is that over the course of the evolution of any language, we use English as the example here, descriptive terms have been generated that actually do cover the variation in personality, and that essentially cover them without bias. Now, that's a hypothesis. Actually, it's an axiom, because the hypothesis is, in some sense, it's not exactly testable. We'll leave that aside for now. It's testable a little bit, but not easy. So that's the first thing you have to accept. You have to accept that it's possible to extract out what constitutes personality by looking at the linguistic representation of descriptors insofar as they're encapsulated in language. Okay, so when people talk about trait models like the Big Five, these comprehensive representations of personality, that isn't exactly what they mean. And you need to know this. What they mean is that it's a comprehensive representation of personality insofar as personality has been encapsulated in language. there may be elements of personality that we haven't been able to talk about, or we don't know how to talk about, that are of crucial importance. And there may not be, but the big five theorists assume that there aren't. All right, so that's a limitation of the theory. But if you accept that, then you say, well, the first thing you want to do is take a relatively random cross-section of the descriptive terms, because then you don't introduce bias into the initial stages of the inquiry. So, Matt, I'll tell you something that we did recently, and you can tell me what you think about it. It's analogous. We were trying to study political correctness. And so the first thing we were trying to figure out was, is there even such a thing? Because if you look at the political dialogue, what you find is that people on the side of the political spectrum who have been defined as politically correct tend to say that it doesn't exist, and that that category is just a pejorative term that was invented by people who hold alternative political opinions. And so the first question is, well, what do you mean something doesn't exist? What do you mean by exist? How do you tell if a psychological concept is real? Like, is anger something that exists objectively? Is it an objective phenomenon? Well, it's not that easy to determine. You say, well, we act like it is, we understand what anger means, but no one goes around in the world and says anger, you know, without saying anything else, or you'd run away from them, you know. What they do is they place the word anger into a sentence and place the sentence within a conversation, and they enable you to infer exactly what they mean by the word anger by listening to the surrounding context, right? And if you're going to turn that into something like an objective term, what you do is you pull out the term anger, and then you make the hypothesis that it represents something real in the objective world. But it's not that easy to determine if something does exist, especially if it's a psychological phenomenon, in the real world. What do you mean by exist? That's the problem of construct validation, okay? So that's another term you really need to know if you're interested in experimental psychology, especially on the personality end. A construct is a representation of something psychological that hypothetically exists objectively. How do you establish its existence objectively? Well, does fear exist? No, you have the problem with all the emotions. Does joy exist? Does surprise exist? Does embarrassment exist? Does guilt exist? Shame? How are they related to one another? Guilt and shame, for example, seem quite similar to one another, right? And pain and fear and anger all share the attribute of unpleasant and negative emotions. How something, if something exists, it should be the same as some things and different from other things. And that's part of construct validation as well, to specify how the construct is the same as some things and different from others. Anger should be reliably distinguishable from joy, for example, because otherwise they're not different. And anger and fear should be somewhat the same if they're both negative emotions. And so it's extraordinarily complex to validate a construct. And so here's what we did with political correctness. And the reason I'm using the political examples is because that's an obvious place where self-serving bias can enter the scientific arena, right? So if I wanted to make a point about political correctness, or if I wanted to make a point about right-wing fascism, I could build my biases into the measurement instruments accidentally, and then they would produce as output what I put into them as input. And I want to protect myself against that if I actually want to do the scientific investigation properly. So what we did when we started to construct our measures of political correctness was employ a number of people to go through as many news sources as they could get their hands on to identify any attitude or behavior, roughly that had been described by anyone at all as potentially politically correct. So it was kind of agnostic. And we were trying to do it as randomly as possible, you know, to get as many news sources as we possibly could, so that we were sampling across the environment without bias. Okay, so then we came up with, I don't remember how many, a couple hundred, maybe more, couple hundred items that were roughly indicative of what you might describe as political correctness. But that's not good enough, right? Because just because you have this random assemblage of items doesn't indicate at all that they're all measuring something that was similar. But that's just implicit. They're all called political correctness, but you don't know if those attitudes co-vary. And what that means is, if you held one attitude of that list, were you more likely to hold another or multiple others, right? So is the conditional probability of holding multiple items, is there a high probability of holding true multiple items simultaneously. Well, you figure that out with factor analysis. So what we did is we turned that into a questionnaire using different question types, and we administered it to several hundred people, and we did a factor analysis, and we found actually that there was such a thing as political correctness because the questions clumped together. People would reliably answer them in a patterned manner, but that there were actually two dimensions that were quite separate. So there isn't one political correctness, there seems to be two. And then we looked at the personality predictors and the IQ predictors and a variety of other predictors that would enable us to come to some understanding of the temperamental proclivity towards those political attitudes, if any. We knew already that political conservatives tended to be low in trait openness, that's the creativity dimension, and high in trait conscientiousness. Whereas political liberals tended to be high in trait openness and low in conscientiousness. And so one of the things that's extraordinarily interesting to know from the Big Five perspective is that your political proclivities are very powerfully influenced by your temperament. And so one of the things you can think about with regards to ongoing political discussions in the real world is that those discussions are actually attempts by people of different temperament, one, to impose their temperamental viewpoints on the world, and two, to engage in a dialogue with people who are actually quite different than they are. So like conscientious people, like they value hard work, rules, order, reliability, integrity, and structure. And so they're dutiful. We analyzed what predicted military performance, for example, in the U.S. Army. Overwhelmingly conscientious. It's not surprising, right? Because it's a very structured, rule-ordered, top-down, follow procedure sort of endeavor. Now, the armed forces had problems with that to some degree because they were also simultaneously looking for people who could think independently on their feet. Because if you're in a battlefield, for example, especially if you're isolated from your command structure, there's going to be times when you have to make extraordinarily difficult decisions on your own. But if you're selected primarily for conscientiousness, that's not going to be your forte, because if you're a conscientious person, what happens is that you enter into a contract with someone, even yourself, and then you carry it out. So now we've also spent a lot of time selecting entrepreneurs. I work with this company in California that has started schools for entrepreneurs in 160 different countries all over the world. The guy who started this, his name is Hideo Resi. He's a real absolute monster. The guy started all those schools in 5 years. 165 schools in all across the world, 8 different languages. And we've been screening people for entrepreneurial ability. And if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you almost have the opposite profile as a soldier. You're very high in openness, and you're lower in conscientiousness, or at least conscientiousness is irrelevant. And the reason for that seems to be that, like, if you're an orderly person and you like to follow procedures and rules, it's kind of hard for you to start a company, because when you first start a company or engage in any other creative process, because entrepreneurs turn out to be the same as artists, you kind of have to, you're not operating within a rule-governed structure. In fact, there may be many times where you have to break a small rule to move properly at a higher level of analysis. There's no algorithmic way of generating a new company, right? Obviously. And so it's people who are very high in openness who happen to be good entrepreneurs. And so that's something I thought was extraordinarily cool, because we'd also already known what predicts managerial, administrative, and academic ability. IQ is crucial for any complex job, so we'll just leave that behind. But what predicts academic ability, for example, at the University of Toronto, it's intelligence, obviously, but also conscientiousness. The correlation between creativity and grades at the U of T is zero. Right. But it's not surprising. The thing is, you know, it's easy to be cynical about that, but one of the things you have to understand about creative people is that they continually step outside of the domain of evaluation structures, right? Because if you're going to say you're going to evaluate the performance of 100 professors on their lecturing ability, well, you kind of have to measure what's common across all the professors in order to come up with the standards for evaluation. Well, that means you're not going to be able to use that structure to evaluate a particularly creative professor, because he or she is going to do something in a way that's so different that it won't show up on the evaluation measure. And of course, that's what happens in universities, you know. Somebody sent me, a couple of days ago, somebody sent me an essay that they had written for their master's thesis that was wildly creative, and they were basically told to leave the program, and that they couldn't continue. Not in a mean way. What happened was that what they were thinking was so outside of the conventions in the discipline is that no one had any idea what to do with the essay. So and that's really the lot of creative people, right? They're always stepping outside of evaluation structure. So it's not that surprising that the relationship between creativity and grades absolutely is zero. We found out as well, by looking at graduate students' performance across multiple institutions, that there was a negative correlation between creativity and graduate school performance. It wasn't even zero, it was worse than negative. Being creative was negative. And you think, well, that can make you cynical as well, but you can't be cynical in that way, because one of the things that happens in science is that science tends to progress incrementally rather than in great leaps. Now and then someone comes along who blows the structure out of a science and advances it ridiculously, like Einstein. But like most people aren't Einstein, and maybe thank God for that. Most of the time, you're in a discipline, you understand the discipline, and then once you've developed understanding of the discipline, you know what the next micro question is that should be answered. And part of the reason that science is so powerful is because it allows people who aren't genius level creatives to make real advances in the generation of knowledge, one tiny micro step at a time. It doesn't matter if there's 100,000 people doing it, and each of them is making a micro step, man. We're zipping along as fast as we possibly want to zip along. And so it turns out to be conscientiousness that's the excellent predictor of graduate student performance. That's the best predictor for law. It's the best predictor for managerial positions. The best predictor for administrative positions. Anything that has a structure of rules that needs to be applied, conscientiousness is a great predictor. So, but it's not good for predicting artistic ability or entrepreneurial ability. And that's also really important, because one of the things, this is partly why bureaucracies stultify, right? Because what happens is as they develop, they get chock full of conscientious people, with a few psychopaths thrown in there just for good measure. They get chock full of conscientious people busily zooming efficiently down a single track, and then all of a sudden the landscape shifts and they're going very, very efficiently in exactly the wrong direction, and then the whole bloody thing falls apart. So you need to have some creative wingnuts in your organization to come up with completely absurd ideas that might just on the off chance be true. And so creativity is strange in that manner too, because it's a high risk, high return game. You're a lot safer in your life to find a functioning entity and to operate as a cog within it, as long as the entity keeps functioning. Because if you're creative and you go off on tangents all the time, there's some probability that one of those tangents is going to be exactly what is needed at the time, and you're going to become hyper successful as a consequence. But there's much more probability that even though some of your ideas might be highly valuable, the probability that this is the right time and place for them is extraordinarily low. So to produce a successful creative product, for example, in the marketplace, you need a ridiculous combination of creativity, so that you keep generating ideas, and then a network around you of people who have skills that you don't, and then the production of a product, let's say, whatever that happens to be, that's actually in demand by the marketplace at exactly that moment, and that someone else hasn't already done better. So the sensible thing to tell anybody who wants to be creative is, that's stupid. You shouldn't do it. Your probability of success is so low that it's better just to do something sensible. But the problem with that is that creative people can't do that because they're creative. And if they shut down their creativity, it's like an extrovert who's gone to live in in an isolated cell. A creative person who isn't being creative, they just wither and die. So they're stuck with it. So, but it is a high risk, high return strategy. So probably better if you want to be creative, or if you are, and you should take this advice to heart, because I've been watching people for a long time. If you want to engage in a creative pursuit, you should find something stable to do that will generate you an income, and you should pursue the thing that you're creative about on the side, because monetizing creative production is so bloody difficult that, especially now, especially in artistic domains, generation of music and that sort of thing, it's like you just have no idea how many million songs there are on the internet, and the vast majority of them commercially available get downloaded 0 times. Like I think there's 80 million songs or something like that on the net, and I believe it's something in the neighborhood of 70 million get downloaded 0 times. And then there's 100 that can get downloaded like 350 million times. And so those people are wildly successful and everyone else collapses in failure. Yep. No. We'll talk about that more. Okay, so that's not a bad overview for initial foray into psychometrics.
Off we go!
So IQ is reliable and valid, more reliable and valid than any other psychometric test ever designed by social scientists. The IQ scales are more psychometric than any other phenomenon that's been discovered by social scientists. Conservatives think there's a job for everyone. They should just get off their asses and get to work. And liberals, no, there isn't a job for everyone. And no, you can't train everyone to do everything. In a complex society like ours, and one that's becoming increasingly complex, there isn't anything for 10% of the population to do. Giving people who have nothing money is helpful. It doesn't work. And differences are difficult to spend. It's not easy to make them go away. There's a real danger in ethnicity. The danger is that you intelligent, values.
For decades, ethnic groups have on average scored significantly. According to psychology professor Richard Hare, whom we interviewed on the channel, there is no scientific consensus on the causes of these average differences in IQ test scores. Yet, according to Hare, psychologists do generally agree that general intelligence exists, that IQ measures it well, that IQ is highly predictive of success in educational and professional terms, and that for decades, ethnic groups have, on average, scored significantly differently. So assuming this is true, should we talk about it? Sam Harris raised this question in a podcast conversation with Charles Murray. Some argue that we should not talk about this, as doing so could fuel the racial supremacist movements that you mentioned, with potentially horrific consequences. Others, mainly on the intellectual dark web, and to a very limited extent in academia, think we should talk about this topic, because average differences in IQ scores have existed for decades. They may have played a role in generating the disparate educational and professional outcomes that we observe and care about, and thus that we cannot properly analyze these disparate outcomes unless we do talk about this subject openly. Geneticist David Wright recently argued in the New York Times that if scientists do not openly discuss the biological basis of race, pseudoscientists could go to that with dangerous consequences. Furthermore, you, Professor Peterson, are highly critical of the oppression narrative that permeates segments of the academy and activist left. And knowledge about average differences in IQ scores between ethnic groups, while tough to assimilate, could puncture this narrative. So the question is, what is your view on all that I've just said?
Jesus, you guys really did take it.
Oh, the enemy's middle tower's gone. Serves them right.
All right, so when I went to Harvard, I went from McGill, and I had spent a lot of time with my advisor there and a research team that we had trying to understand the genesis of antisocial
Can anyone hear me? It's a killing spree over here. The enemy's middle
among
tower's gone.
adolescents.
Serves them right.
Well, kids as well. Antisocial behavior is very persistent, so if you have a child who's conduct disordered at the age of 4, the probability that they will be criminal at the age of 15 or 20 is extremely high. It's unbelievably stable.
We did
it's
it.
a very
Or they did it, I should say. They did it.
early
Radiant
onset
people did
aggressive
it.
kids, and it's persistent. And then you look at the intervention literature and you throw up your hands because no interventions work. And believe me, psychologists have tried everything you could possibly imagine and a bunch of things that you can't in order to ameliorate that. So we were really interested in trying to understand, for example, if you're antisocial by the age of 4, then there isn't an intervention that seems to be effective. So, and the standard penological theory is really quite horrifying in this regard, because what you see is that male aggression peaks around the age of 15, and then it declines fairly precipitously and sort of normalizes again by the age of 27. And standard penological theory essentially is this cold-hearted. It's like if you have someone who's a multiple offender, you just throw them in prison until they're 27. Then they age out of it. And that's all there is to it. That's what we've got. Now, there's some downside to that, because there's a corollary literature that suggests that the worst thing that you can do with antisocial people is to group them together, which is what we do in prisons. So that's a whole mess. Anyways, one of the things we were doing was trying to see if there might be cognitive predictors of antisocial behavior. And so we used this battery of neuropsychological tests that was put together at the Montreal Neurological Institute. Took about 11 hours to administer, and hypothetically assessed prefrontal cortical function. And we computerized that, reduced it to about 90 minutes, and then assessed antisocial adolescents in Montreal, and found out that they did show deficits in problem-solving ability that we associated with prefrontal ability. When I got to Harvard, I thought, well, that's interesting. We could use the neuropsych battery to predict negative behavior. Perhaps we could use it to predict positive behavior. So I thought, well, what if we turned the neuropsych battery over and thought, well, can we predict grades, for example? Because that's a decent thing to predict. So we ran a study. That looked at Harvard kids, University of Toronto kids, line workers at a Milwaukee factory, and managers and executives at the same factory. And what we found was that the average score across these neuropsychological tests, they were kind of like games. They were game-like, So in one test, there were 5 lights in the middle of the screen, and a box was associated with each light, and you had to learn by trial and error which box was associated with each light. That was one of the tests. So we took people's average score across the tests, because they seemed to clump together into a single structure. You can find that out statistically. If you take a bunch of tests, you can find out how they clump together statistically by looking at their patterns of correlations. And you might get multiple clumps, which is what happens with personality research, where you get 5, or you might get a singular clump, which is what happens in cognitive research. And we got a single clump, essentially. And then we were trying to figure out if, at the same time, I was reading the literature on performance prediction. And there's an extensive literature on performance prediction, a lot of it generated by the armed forces, by the way, indicating that IQ is a very good predictor of long-term life success. And so here's the general rule. If your job is simple, which means you do the same thing every day, then IQ predicts how fast you'll learn the job, but not how well you do it. But if your job is complex, which means that the demands change on an ongoing basis, then the best predictor of success is general cognitive ability. And I learned that the general cognitive ability tests clump together into a single factor. That's fluid intelligence, or IQ. And then we didn't know if the factor that we had found was the same factor as IQ. And we still haven't really figured out whether or not that was the case, because it kind of depends on how you do the analysis. But anyways, I got deeply into the performance prediction literature, and I found out, well, if you wanted to predict people's performance in life, there's a couple of things you need to know. You need to know their general cognitive ability if they're going to do a complex job. You need to know their trait conscientiousness. Some of you might have heard that rebranded as grit in a very corrupt act, by the way, because it's a good predictor of long-term life success. Freedom from negative emotion, low neuroticism, is another predictor, but it's sort of third on the hierarchy. And then openness to experience, which is a personality trait, is associated with expertise in creative domains. The evidence that, now I should tell you, this is such a complicated question, I should tell you how to make an IQ test. It's actually really easy, and you need to know this to actually understand what IQ is. So imagine that you generated a set of 10,000 questions, okay, about anything. They could be math problems, they could be general knowledge, they could be vocabulary, they could be multiple choice. It really doesn't matter what they're about, as long as they require abstraction to solve. So they'd be formulated linguistically, but mathematically would also apply. And then you have those 10,000 questions. Now you take a random set of 100 of those questions, and you give them to 1,000 people, and all you do is sum up the answers, right? So some people are going to get most of them right, and some of them are going to get most of them wrong. You just rank order the people in terms of their score. Correct that for age and you have IQ. That's all there is to it. And what you'll find is that no matter which random set of 100 questions you take, the people at the top of one random set will be at the top of all the others, and with very, very, very high consistency. So one thing you need to know is that if any social science claims whatsoever are correct, then the IQ claims are correct, because the IQ claims are more psychometrically rigorous than any other phenomenon that's been discovered by social scientists. Now, the IQ literature is a dismal literature. No one likes it. Here's why. Here's an example. So here's a fun little fact for you, for liberals and conservatives alike. Because conservatives think there's a job for everyone if people just get off their asses and get to work. And liberals think, well, you can train anyone to do anything. It's like, no, there isn't a job for everyone. And no, you can't train everyone to do everything. That's wrong. And here's one of the consequences of that. So as I mentioned, the Armed Forces has done a lot of work on IQ, and they started back in 1919. And the reason they did that was because, well, for obvious reasons. Let's say there's a war, and you want to get qualified people into the officer positions as rapidly as possible, or you'll lose. So that's a reason. Now, the Armed Forces has experimented with IQ tests since 1919. And in the last 20 years, a law was passed as a consequence of that analysis, which was that it was illegal to induct anyone into the Armed Forces who had an IQ of less than 83. Now the question is why? And the answer was, all of that effort put in by the Armed Forces indicated that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there wasn't anything that you could be trained to do in the military that wasn't positively counterproductive. Now you got to think about that, because the military is chronically desperate for people, right? It's not like people are lining up to be inducted, right? They have to go out and recruit, and it's not easy. And so they're desperate to get their hands on every body they can possibly manage. And then, especially in wartime, but also in peacetime. But then there was another reason too, which was the Armed Forces was also set up from a policy perspective to take people in the underclass, let's say, and train them and move them up at least into the working class or maybe the middle class. So there's a policy element to it too. And so even from that perspective, you could see that the military is desperate to bring people in. But well, with an IQ of 83 or less, it's not happening. Okay, so how many people have an IQ of 83 or less? 10%. Now, if that doesn't hurt you to hear, then you didn't hear it properly. Because what it implies is that in a complex society like ours, and one that's becoming increasingly complex, there isn't anything for 10% of the population to do. All right, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to ignore that? We're going to run away from that? And believe me, we have every reason to. Or we're going to contend with the fact that we need to figure out how it might be possible to find a place for people on the lower end of the general cognitive distribution to take their productive and worthwhile place in society. And that isn't just going to be a matter of dumping money down the hierarchy, because giving people who have nothing to do money isn't helpful. It doesn't work. It's not that simple. Well, so that's kind of an answer to the question of whether or not we should deal with IQ forthrightly. It's like, if you can find a flaw in that logic, like, just go right ahead. It's not like I was thrilled to death to discover all of this. By no stretch of the imagination was that the case. So what? So IQ is reliable and valid. That's the first thing. It's more reliable and valid than any other psychometric test ever designed by social scientists by a factor of about 3. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2 is it predicts long-term life outcome at about 0.3, 0.4, which leaves about 85%, 70 to 85% of the story unexplained, but it's still the best thing that we have. Well, it's also the case that in places like Great Britain, when IQ tests were first introduced, they were actually used by the socialists, and they were used to identify poor people who had potential, cognitive potential, and to move them into institutes of higher education. So there's an upside, a social upside as well. ethnic differences. This is something you can't say anything about without immediately being killed. So I'm hesitant to broach the topic. But I'll tell you one thing that I did in the last week that's relevant to this. And this just shows you how complex the problem is. First of all, we should point out that race is a very difficult thing to define because racial boundaries aren't tight, right? So when you talk about racial differences in IQ, you're faced with the thorny problem of defining race. And that's a big problem from a scientific perspective. But we'll leave that aside. And I wrote an article this week. Somebody stood up at one point in one of my talks, and Vice, bless their hearts, took this particular question and used it as an indication of the quality of the people who are my so-called followers. And by the way, the quality of my so-called followers is pretty damn high.
Trump.
And you can find that out quite rapidly just by looking at the YouTube comments, which are head and shoulders above the standard set of YouTube comments, I can tell you that. So someone asked me about the Jewish question, right? And the implication, it was actually someone Jewish, and the implication was that Jews are overrepresented in positions of authority and power. And I had just spoken for like an hour and a half, and you know, this guy had an axe to grind, and I thought, there's no goddamn way I'm getting into this at the moment. And so I said I can't answer that question. But that's not a very good answer. So I wrote a blog post this week, and I said, look, here's the situation. All right. Jews are overrepresented in positions of power and authority. But then let's open our eyes a little bit, eh? And think for like 2 or 3 seconds and think, hey, guess what? They're also overrepresented in positions of competence. And it's not like we have more geniuses than we know what to do with. And if the Jews happen to be producing more of them, which they are, by the way, then that's a pretty good thing for the rest of us. So let's not confuse competence with power and authority, even though that's a favorite trick of the radical leftists, who always fail to make that distinction. Well, why does this overrepresentation occur? Because it does. There's also overrepresentation in political movements, including radical political movements. Okay, why? Well, answer 1, Jewish conspiracy. Okay, that's not a very good answer. We've used that answer before. All right, but do we have an alternative? Well, here's an alternative. The average Ashkenazi IQ is somewhere between 110 and 115, which is about 1 standard deviation above the population average. And so what that means is that the average Ashkenazi / European Jew has an IQ that's higher than 85% of the population. That's a lot higher. Now, that doesn't make that much difference in the middle of the distribution, okay? But geniuses don't exist at the middle of the distribution. They exist at the tails of the distribution. And you don't need much of a move at the mean to produce walloping differences at the tails.
Your turn
and
to
the tails are important because a lot of where we draw exceptional people from the exception.
Yeah, 5 seconds left now.
So back to IQ. One final thing to say about IQ.
Your turn to pick, bro.
The ethnic differences are difficult to dispense with. It's not easy to make them go away. You can say, well, the tests aren't culture fair. Well, here's a test of that. So imagine you test group A with an IQ test, and you test group B with an IQ
it's your
test.
turn to pick.
And then you look at their actual performance in whatever you're predicting. If the test was biased against ethnic group A, then it would underpredict their performance. And that doesn't happen. Now you could say, well, there's systemic bias in the performance measures and the potential measures. And that's a possibility. All right. Now, one other thing about that. There's a real danger in the ethnicity IQ debate, and the danger is that we confuse intelligence with value, or that we confuse intelligence with human value. That's a better way of thinking about it. And one of the things that we're going to have to understand here is that that's a mistake, is that being more intelligent doesn't make you a better person. That's not the case. It makes you more useful for complex cognitive operations, but you can be pretty damn horrific as a genius son of a bitch, right? It's morally neutral, and we also know that from the psychometric data, by the way. There doesn't seem to be any relationship whatsoever between intelligence and virtue. And so if it does turn
hello,
out
it's your turn
that
to pick.
nature and the fates do not align with our egalitarian presuppositions, which is highly probable, we shouldn't therefore make the mistake of assuming that if group A or person A is lower on one of these attributes than group B or person B, that that is somehow reflective of their intrinsic value as human beings. That's a big mistake.
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to begin by introducing Jordan Peterson, and then I will talk a little bit about how this event is going to work, and then we'll get underway. So Jordan Peterson has been called, quote, one of the most important thinkers to emerge on the world stage for many years by The Spectator. He has been a dishwasher, gas jockey, bartender, short order cook, beekeeper, oil derrick bit retipper, plywood mill laborer, and railway line worker. He's taught mythology to lawyers, doctors, and businessmen, consulted for the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on sustainable development, helped his clinical clients manage depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, anxiety, and schizophrenia, served as an advisor to senior partners of major law firms, identified thousands of promising entrepreneurs on 6 different continents, and lectured extensively in North America and Europe. He has flown a hammerhead roll in a carbon fiber stunt plane, piloted a mahogany racing sailboat around Alcatraz Island, explored an Arizona meteorite crater with a group of astronauts, built a Native American longhouse on the upper floor of his Toronto home, and been inducted into the Coastal Pacific Kwakwaka'wakw tribe. Malcolm Gladwell discussed psychology with him while researching his books. Norman Doidge is a good friend and collaborator. Thriller writer Greg Hurwitz employed several of his, quote, valuable things as a plot feature in his #1 international bestseller, Orphan X, and he worked with Jim Balsillie, former RIM CEO, on a project for the UN Secretary General. With his students and colleagues, Dr. Peterson has published more than 100 scientific papers, transforming the modern understanding of personality and revolutionized the psychology of religion.
Cuddle in with me.
As a Harvard professor, he was nominated for the prestigious Levinson Teaching Prize and is regarded by his current University of Toronto students as one of 3 truly life-changing teachers. Dr. Peterson is a Quora most viewed writer in values and principles in parenting and education. He has innumerable Twitter followers and Facebook followers. His YouTube channel now has and his classroom.
You know what's better than first blood? Nothing.
First blood series
Okay,
on TV
let's blow something up.
Dr. Peterson's online self-help program, the Self-Authoring Suite, has been featured in the Oprah magazine, on CBC Radio, and on NPR's national website. It has helped over 150,000.
Jesus Christ.
And reading the material that I needed to read in order to write the book
Thank you.
continually as well. And I didn't realize until more recently that what I was doing was at the heart of the postmodern conundrum, I would say. I was very much obsessed by the events of the Cold War for reasons I don't exactly understand. I had a lot of dreams about nuclear annihilation for years on end. I mean, it wasn't that uncommon to be obsessed by that when I grew up. I mean, because it was a preoccupation of everyone who was my age, I suppose. There were lots of years, probably between 1962, I would say, probably in 1985, where people were pretty convinced that the probability of a nuclear war was high, much higher now than people consider now. And I was curious about this. I was curious about why everyone wasn't obsessed about this all the time, first of all, because it seemed like the fundamental issue that 2 armed camps were pointing something in excess of 25,000 hydrogen bombs each at each other. I couldn't understand how anybody could concentrate on anything other than that, since it seemed so utterly insane. And I was curious. What was going on exactly?
First blood.
It was ours
was this
all along.
one explanation was that there's a very large number of ways that human beings could organize themselves in society, like a large number of games that we could hypothetically play, and they're all equally arbitrary in an equally arbitrary universe, and that the communists had decided to play one kind of game, and the West and the Western free market democratic types had decided to play another game, and it was all arbitrary in some sense.
You sure?
Quit arguing.
And so that's what I was trying to figure out, was what the hell was going on with this conflict, and was it merely a battle between two hypothetically equally valid interpretations of the world drawn from a set of extraordinarily large potential interpretations, which I think would be essentially a postmodernist take on it. And I think I went into the problem neutrally, in that I didn't think I knew what the answer was. You know, so lots of times when you talk to people who think, or when you talk to people who write, they have an idea and it's right, and then they write whatever they're writing to justify the idea. That's how they look at it. But it's not a good way to write. A good way to write and think is to have a problem and then try to solve it, right? To actually solve it, not to demonstrate that your a priori commitment is true. And, you know, one of the signs, I would say, that my a priori commitments weren't the purpose for the writing was that I walked away from that 15-year project with a view of the world that was completely different than the view that I had going in, and learned all sorts of things, especially about the role of narrative and religious thinking in life that I had no idea was possible when I started. And a lot of that was a consequence of reading the great people who I read. I read, well, all the great works of Friedrich Nietzsche and the great works of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and most of Jung's collected works, everything that had been published up to that point, and a very large swath of the relevant clinical literature, the great clinicians of the 20th century, and a huge stack of neuroscience, and et cetera, because I was reading constantly during this time. And I realized some things that I think are true. The communists were wrong. They weren't, and not just a little bit wrong, and not wrong in some arbitrary way. They were playing a game that human beings cannot play without descending into a murderous catastrophe. And there's something about what we've done in the West that's correct.
Well, your top tower's under attack.
And it's hard, it's complicated, because our cognitive structures, that's one way of thinking about it, or our socio-political arrangements, they actually parallel one another in an important way, are grounded in a strange set of axioms, and the axioms aren't rational precisely. It's more like they're narrative. They're narrative axioms. They're stories. And the story of the West is that the individual is sovereign over the group, and that that's the solution to tribalism. And I think that's the correct solution. Now, what that means metaphysically, because it's also embedded in our religious doctrines, right? Because especially in Christianity, although not exclusively to Christianity, the individual is sovereign. The suffering individual is sovereign. And there's something about that that's true, at least psychologically. And I don't know what that might mean metaphysically, because who the hell knows what anything means metaphysically, right? I mean, your knowledge runs out, right, at some point. Anyways, I worked all these ideas out, and then I taught for a long time courses that were based on the ideas, and the courses were very impactful, I would say. They had the same impact on the people that I was teaching as walking through the material had on me. And, well, it was out of that all this political controversy arose. I mean, I was never focused on political controversy, even though I'm interested in politics, and I thought at many points in my life, although my political career, I always put it aside for a psychological and philosophical career, I would say. And but things started to shift badly in Canada over the last 5 years, and our government dared to implement legislation that compelled speech. And one of the things that I had learned when I was doing all this background investigation was that there isn't a higher value than free speech. It isn't free speech. It's not the right way of thinking about it, because it's free thought. And even that's not the right way of thinking about it, because thought is the precursor to action and life. So there's no difference between free speech and free life. And I was just not willing to put up with restrictions on my free life. And so I made some videos pointing out the pathology of this doctrine and the fact that the government had radically overreached its appropriate limits. And well then, well, and maybe you don't know, but I've been enveloped in continual scandal since for 18 months, which to me, as a clinician, indicates that I got my damn diagnosis right. Right? It's not about pronouns. It's about something a lot deeper than that. And I stand by that. I believe that it's the case. And I don't think that we would all be here tonight if that wasn't the situation.
So I wanted my first question to be about Lafayette, and so I thought I would read a couple of Facebook posts that certain students who are critical of you read in the lead up to this event, and just ask you to respond.
Okay.
So this is a student writing, Lafayette College, I'm utterly disappointed that you're allowing this to take place on our campus. I thought we went through this last semester. Inviting hateful speakers who make wildly unsubstantiated claims is not going to fly with the student body. I get it. The Mill Series events are private and not endorsed by the college, but you absolutely have the power to make a statement on this. The fact that you're not is an embarrassment to our community. If you believe this man is a legitimate source of knowledge because he has a degree in clinical psychology, feel free to ask our psychology department faculty and counseling center staff about the validity of his claims. I'm certain they would not endorse this speaker. Do better, in all caps. For those of you unfamiliar, Jordan Peterson is known for denouncing the Me Too movement, claiming that women are in no way marginalized in the West, arguing against the existence of gender-neutral pronouns, arguing against gun control in the U.S., and claiming that identity politics and social justice movements are part of a devious Marxist agenda, and another student. College conservatives know that if they bring in a speaker who is willing to blatantly insult a portion of the audience, and the libs get angry enough about this for good reason, then they may get an op-ed written about them in the New York Times. As a result, there are a whole group of hacks, like Milo and Peterson, who get famous and invited purely for their promise to misgender trans students and advocate provocative but ultimately toothless arguments about social Darwinist race theory. What I'm saying is that you have every right to be pissed. Jordan Peterson is a harmful moron, but know that you being pissed is also 100% of the point of why he was elected. He's not a conservative, he's just a guy who's mildly racist enough to offend college liberals and therefore secure wins for the cultural right.
Comparatively mild stuff. It's the chattering buzz of ideologically possessed demons. So there's nothing in it that's not entirely predictable. That's one of the things you know.
Get up on out of here, because Radiant just fortified their structures.
You want to find out whether the person is there or the ideology is there. You listen to see if you're hearing anything that someone else of the same ideological mindset couldn't have told you. You know, like I've had thousands of conversations because I've spent 20 years as a clinical psychologist. One of the things I've learned about people is that they're unbelievably interested. If you get someone to sit down and you move past the superficial, you can actually do quite rapidly. They'll tell you all sorts of things that only they know, that are unbelievably enlightening about their own peculiar problems, about the way they look at the world, about their idiosyncratic familial dynamics, like just fascinating personal stuff. It's the stuff of great novels, you know, and this is ordinary people. I don't really think there is an ordinary person exactly. There's the facade of ordinariness, but behind that, people are very, very ordinary.
Killing spree.
And so the conversations are almost instantaneously fascinating. And one of the guidelines that I used in my clinical practice constantly was, like I had this sense, I probably learned this mostly from Carl Rogers, was that if the conversation wasn't really interesting, then we weren't doing anything that was therapeutically useful. But all of the interesting elements of it were very, very personal. And so, to replace this, and I learned this mostly from
Dyer, you gotta fortify them, their structures. Good
what I
work.
would call ideological possession. He talked about people he met in the Gulag camps who were under the sway of rigid communist orthodoxy, and noted very clearly that it was like there was a crank in some sense on the side of their head, and you could just crank the crank and out would come the ideological dogma, and it's all entirely predictable. And people who are in a situation like that don't understand that they're possessed by an idea, right? Carl Jung said people don't have ideas, ideas have people. It's like, so there's nothing in that that's anything other than exactly what you would predict. And then there's a deeper issue too, and this is one that I think has bedeviled me since I made my initial videos, which is it's impossible for those on the radical left to admit that anyone who opposes what they're doing might be reasonable, because what that would mean would be that you can be reasonable and oppose the radical left, and that would imply that what the radical left was doing wasn't reasonable. And so, instead of dealing with the fact that I actually happen to be quite reasonable, the attempt is to
Yo, Quap's going
assume
ape shit.
that
Rotate.
anyone who objects must be part of the radical
you're not
right.
gonna like
It's
this.
like,
The top
well,
tower's under
actually,
attack.
no. There's lots of space between the radical left and the radical right. There's the moderate, reasonable left, for example, and then there's
so
the
good.
center, and then there's the moderate, reasonable right, and then there's the far right, and then there's the extreme right. All of that exists in opposition to the radical left.
Double kill.
It's very
Dun, dun,
convenient
dun,
for the
dun,
radical
dun,
left
dun,
to
dun,
say,
dun.
Your top
you
tower's
didn't
under
buy our
attack.
doctrine, and then to immediately make the presupposition that you must be the most heinous example of that entire array of
Oh, geez, your
potential
top tower's under
objections.
attack.
It's like, yeah, well, whatever. You know, it's just not a
Your top
viable
tower just got
stance.
shattered.
And so,
Take us.
but it's convenient, and
Let's go.
it's a bad thing. It drives polarization. And that's a bad thing. But it also doesn't address the issue. So one of the things that I've been thinking about deeply over the last couple of weeks and plan to write about, here's a mystery for all of you. I don't care what your political background is. It isn't like I'm anti-left. I've made videos documenting
We're
this.
going.
I know why there's a left wing. There's a left wing because inequality is a problem. It's a way worse problem than the radical leftists like to admit, because you can't lay it at the feet of capitalism and the free market. Inequality is a way worse problem than that. But it's definitely a problem. And because inequality is a problem, you need part of the political structure to speak up for the people who end up arrayed at the bottom of hierarchy. It's crucial. Someone has to speak for them. That's the place of the left. But then consider this. So we can state that. The right
Concerned
speaks
about
for
bottom.
hierarchy and the left speaks on behalf of those who are oppressed.
She's there, she's bot.
Good. We need that dialogue.
Going. We're
The
going.
radical left.
Oh, I'm shooting arrows.
Okay. We know from 20th century history that things can go too far on the right,
the enemy's
no
middle
one disputes
tower's
that,
gone.
and that
Serves
things
them
can
right.
go too far on the left. And we also know that when things go too far, it's seriously not good, right? So,
Inspector, if you need farm, feel free to take it. If you need to miss out on some fights, feel free to.
We had God only knows how many people murdered as a consequence of internal repression. At least 100.
Like, you need a solid
And
good
we
20
risked
minutes
putting
of
the entire planet
basically free farm to become very
putting the
useful in the
planet into
mid-game.
flames. Okay, so that's the consequence. All right, so now, in the aftermath of World War II, let's say we come to some sort of sociological agreement, I would say, that you can identify the radical right-wingers. If people make claims of racial superiority, you
Hey,
put them in a
Miranda,
box,
remember when
say,
you
well, you're
weren't
outside
using
of
your mic?
acceptable political district. And so you saw that with William
It was
F.
muted.
Buckley in the 60s.
Damn.
I'm
I
hurt.
wish it was still muted. Because right now all you're
Yeah,
using it
fuck
for is
yourself.
calling out obvious stuff, so we don't really need to hear it.
So now we kind of have a sense.
I
of
jumped!
where you've
I used
crossed
the
damn
clarity.
line.
I'm trying to stay alive. Nice job.
Superiority domain, ethnic superiority domain.
You know what we
Like,
don't need?
No,
Your
you've
fucking
got-
sass, bro.
All right. Here's the question.
I think when I'm
Where
pointing
the
out
hell
a
do you
fact,
cross
not
the line
sass, but you're
on the
cute.
left?
So I guess you get away with
Exactly.
it.
Well, the answer is who knows? Well, that's not a very good answer. I would say it's incumbent It's
SF
incumbent
exploded on
people
2
in
very
the
low
center
health heroes.
and in the moderate left to say, look, things can go too far on the left, and here's how we know that happened. And that
Yeah, I'll grab
hasn't
it in a
happened
sec.
at all.
Coming for it.
Now, I think there's a reason for that. I think there's a technical reason as well as a motivational reason. Two technical reasons.
I don't want to go
harder
near
for
the
people
tower
on the
because
left to
they'll
draw
just TP
boundaries.
in right now.
Because people on the left aren't boundary
They all
drawing
just got off
types.
fucking
They're
being
boundary
rezzed.
dissolving
Yep.
types.
Look, they all. Spectre,
all
get back, get back, get
visible
back.
in their
Spectre,
rings.
get
The
back.
second problem is it doesn't look to me
Okay,
like there is
we're
a
good.
smoking pistol on the left. That's as
Sorry about
obvious
that.
as racist. You're already
Scaring
gone.
me.
No, it's like
Like
there-
Top's
in
free
Canada,
farm.
There's a lot of push for this triumvirate
nobody
of
top.
radical
And there's nobody
ideas,
up there, too.
diversity, inclusivity, and equity. Diversity, like well,
Die, bitch.
Yeah, he's a little bit there. I'll admit.
Equity, that's a more bitter pill to swallow, because that's equality of outcome. For me, that's
I just like to get you guys involved in the level of hype I'm feeling.
Yeah, you sound really high.
You got a
sound
problem
like
with that,
somebody
I'm
on
sorry.
diversity, inclusivity, and equality of outcome.
Nah, bro, I'm just
Then
fucking
you've gone
stoned.
too far. And you might disagree.
I'm stuck in some
You might
trees,
disagree,
though.
and that's
Anybody
fine,
got some
disagree.
choppers?
That's what I mean.
If that
You
isn't the
just
market
sound high.
too far, then
Oh, jeez, middle tower.
obviously that's not good. And close on that, I would also say to the people on the moderate left, if you want your doctrine
middle tower's
to
under
have
attack.
purchase and to continue to speak for those who stack up at the bottom of inevitable hierarchies, then you owe it to
I
yourself
hit him.
to
I'm a
dissociate
fucking retard.
yourself from the dangerous radicals.
Alright, let's
because
go.
otherwise they
They're all here.
invalidate your ideas. And that doesn't seem to be but they have
Spectre,
it.
you might want to pick up a calling blade.
No idea.
It's usually one of the core items for Spectre.
Let's go.
Okay, so you've changed the lives of many young people and adults in this country.
Man, I
in
hate when this guy
Huddersfield,
talks.
In the West, in the world. You have a massive following. My girlfriend's parents call you Uncle Joe, for example. On the other hand, and this is just a fact, tons of people on the left, as we've just seen, because of your power and also your frontal attack on a lot of their views, hate and viciously.
Baiting.
Then there are these other figures, like Jonathan Haidt and Robbie George.
Was that just
They
prepared
have
for
a
your
lot in
death or
common.
what?
We go.
They are respected academics. They are at least relatively well
I'm
known
gonna jump into
outside
that
academia.
shit and have them
They
chase
share
me.
your critiques of the community, of student
Not that
activists,
stupid.
of trends in Western culture. They don't have
I don't know
nearly the
about that.
following that you do, but they also aren't as
Man,
hated
I've been paying
or
attention the
viciously
entire time.
caricatured. Moreover,
They've avoided
they
obvious
may
mind traps.
Okay,
have
man.
changed
I
the
see you
minds
know
of more
everything.
people
It's
on
fine.
college campuses. That
It's
is,
just simple
people on
observations.
campuses
I don't
who
know what
have
you're
some
talking about. I know
sympathy for
everything.
left activists, or who may
The fool
agree with
claims he
much of
knows
what
everything.
you say, but react negatively to confrontation and harsh criticism. Haidt has appealed to such individuals by taking the Dale Carnegie win friends and influence people approach. So my questions are, first, do you agree with this dichotomy? Second, did you consciously choose one path over the other, and if so, why?
Well, with Haidt, for example, it's more power to him as far as I'm concerned. You know, he has a different temperament than me. He's more introverted. He's less volatile, I would say.
40,
Probably more agreeable
middle tower.
or more
I'm
polite.
gonna look at it.
Middle tower's
And
under
I think
attack.
that what he's doing is extremely effective, especially
not
from the
time.
perspective of very carefully documenting the empirical facts about the ideological. Ideological.
He was solo top, to be fair.
left-leaning ideological tilt of campuses, which is
Oh,
something
jeez,
that
Rick,
needs to
the
be
top tower's getting hit.
explored on empirical ground. So, like I said, more power to him, and there's nothing wrong with being reasonable. I guess. And then you ask, well, is that the right pathway for me? It's like, well, apparently not.
There's nobody top.
What happened when I made my initial video? I'd talked to people a lot. I've worked with people a lot about negotiation. It's one of the things that I specialized in, I would say, in consulting practice, is teaching people how to negotiate. I can tell you some things about negotiating that you might find interesting and useful. You can't negotiate positions weakness. So all of you who are going to be developing your careers in the future, you need to understand that if you want to push your career forward, well, first of all, that you do in fact have to push it forward, because if you're confident and silent, you will be ignored.
Looks like dire structures are
And,
fortified.
that's rough, because you might think, well, people should reward you because you're competent. And yes, of course they should. But if you're competent and silent, then you're not a problem. You're just part of the background that's keeping everything functioning. And so if you want to develop your career in terms of promotion, say, and salary, it's like you have to be competent and you have to be strategic. And to be strategic when you negotiate for a new position or for a new salary, you have to be able to say, if you don't give me what I want, then something you don't like will happen to you. And what that means, it's not a physical threat, it's that you have an option. So you have your CV, your resume in order, right? You're educated and competent and desirable to people outside of your immediate job. You're willing to instantly put yourself in the job market and undergo the stress of finding a new position and undergoing all of that. And you have that all planned out, so that when you go talk to the person you're negotiating with your salary, you're credible. And see, because it's very seldom that you're talking to the person who's at the top of the pecking order, let's say. What you need to do then with them is to tell them a story that they can tell to their boss to make you not a problem. And a good story is, look, we really need this person because they're hyper competent and they have a better offer. It's like, well, then you're going to win the negotiation. But if you go in there with no power, well, you're going to lose, obviously. So the first thing that you need to know if you're going to negotiate is that you have to say,
your middle tower just really took a big crap.
And what no means is that you're not going to do it.
Nice 40.
And
Good
when
one.
I made the videos about Bill C-16, I thought it through. And I thought, there's no damn way I'm following this law. I don't care what happens. And I didn't say that lightly. I thought it through. I thought, okay, well, let's assume the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario would be that the student would report me to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and then they would do an investigation. Then they would find me guilty because the Ontario Human Rights Commission finds 99% of the people brought to it
Yo, heal up and come down
that's
here.
what totalitarians
Fucking
do.
gank them all.
And then I would refuse to pay the fine or cooperate with whatever the re-education they would put me through would be. And then that would move to civil court, and then I would be fined for contempt, and then it would, then the whole legal catastrophe would unfold. And I thought, well, I could either do that, or I could allow the government to regulate my speech. It's like, nope, that's not happening. So you might think about that as confrontation. And it is confrontational. It's like,
That wasn't good.
a goddamn thing
But we're
that
okay.
is done to me to make me allow the government to compel my
God
speech.
damn.
That's not happening. And the reason for that, I believe the reason for that is because I spent decades studying totalitarianism. It's not good. And the way the totalitarian states develop is that people give up their right to be, their right to exist with their own thoughts. They lie. That's what happens because individuals sacrifice their own soul to the dictates of the state. And then everything goes badly sideways. It's like, and you think, well, how much evidence for that do we need?
Nice job.
You're looking at 250 million deaths. Like, isn't that enough? Well, the people that I read who were profound, Viktor Frankl's a good example for beginners. If you want to read about this sort of thing, wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And Frankl, and also Solzhenitsyn, and a variety of other commentators as well, who really looked into what happened in both in Nazi Germany and in the communist states. Their conclusion was universal, is that the lies of the state, the lies and tyranny of the state are aided and abetted by the moral sacrifice of the individual. It's not top down. The Nazis are telling you what to do and you're all innocent and obey. That's not how it works. You falsify your being bit by bit, and you end up where you don't want to be. And that's a bad idea. And if you're interested in that, there's a great book called Ordinary Men. You read that and you won't be the same person afterwards, so I would beware of reading it. But it's a story about these policemen in Germany. So they were middle-aged guys. Bad idea. And if you're interested in that, there's a great book called Ordinary Men.
Ordinary Men.
You read that and you won't be the same person afterwards, so I would beware of reading it. But it's a story about these policemen in Germany. So they were middle-aged guys, you know, and they grew up and were socialized before the Nazis came to power. So they're just your typical middle-class policemen. And they were brought into Poland after the Nazis had charged with keeping order in the occupied state. And they knew, their commander knew that it was going to be brutal because they were in wartime, and they regard the Jews, for example, as enemies, and so there was going to be a fair bit of rounding up with all of that, with all of what that implied. The commander told the policemen that they could go home if they wanted to, that they didn't have to participate in this. And then what Ordinary Men does is document their transformation from ordinary policemen, the sort of people that you know, the guys who were taking naked pregnant women out into the middle of the field and shooting them in the back of the head. And it documents one step at a time how an ordinary person turns into someone like that. You think, well, we don't want that sort of thing to happen anymore. Well, then you don't want to be that sort of person. That's how it's fixed. And if you're not going to be that sort of person, then you don't take the first steps. Because the first steps lead you down a pathway that, at least in principle, you don't want to go. So, well, I think part of the combat, I'd say, compared to someone like Haidt, is that I've spent years looking at the worst things there are to look at. And I've learned from that, and I've certainly learned things that I won't do. And one of them is, I won't let the government regulate my speech. It's a mistake. I don't care what compassionate principles hypothetically motivates that move. It was unprecedented in English common law, that move. It was all buried under this leftist compassion, which is mostly, it's mostly a lie. I have reasons, I think, other than those that motivate someone like Jonathan Haidt to be particularly passionate about it.
On the subject of totalitarianism, I wanted to do something very quickly. So I'm guessing that even though most people in the room have negative views of both men, they have a more intensely negative view of Hitler than of Stalin.
We're going!
I'm guessing almost everyone in the room has a far more negative, visceral reaction to the swastika than to the hammer and sickle. Some of the protesters at your event at McMaster University stood behind a banner with a hammer and sickle. You've said that a hammer and sickle is no funnier than a swastika. That, quote, the reprehensible ideologies that are based in fundamental Marxism killed at least 100 million people in the 20th century, unquote. I've discussed this proposition with numerous people in recent months, and almost no one seems to buy it. No one disputes the body count under socialist regimes. Few dispute that Stalin was a vicious murderer, roughly on par with Hitler in moral terms. Most think that communism should not be tried again. In other words, they share your critique of the argument that previous communist experiments did not represent proper communism and that proper communism should be tried. Nevertheless, they still disagree with you that we should react as negatively to the hammer and sickle as we do to the swastika. Why? Because they say the two ideologies are not morally comparable. National Socialism is much worse morally than Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. So what do you say to this?
Oh, jeez, he's dominating!
Students.
Well, we'll call them budding intellectuals. It is a mystery, you know. It is a mystery because it is the case that there is something about the Nazi doctrine that seems to be viscerally that the communist doctrine doesn't have. I said when I first and I said it might be
Initiating killing spree mode.
issue of racial superiority. You know,
Man,
something
you might as well
single
save
that
that
you can put
energy.
your finger
Against
on.
radiant, just fortify
Whereas what's
the
happening on the
structures.
left that's horrifying is murky. It might even be multidimensional. Like maybe there isn't a single radical
enemy's
leftist
bottom tower.
idea
It's
that's
gone.
murderous like the racial superiority doctrine. Maybe it's a combination of the three. Or
I
maybe
had a
it's some
fucking
set of
mango
4 out
there,
of
I'm
10.
retarded.
Who knows? So, and because of that, it doesn't seem as repugnant. And there was also a universalizing tendency among communists that seemed to be less morally reprehensible than the
Oh boy,
ethno-nationalism of the Nazis. So, you know, you
top
think,
tower's
if you
under
go back to
attack.
Structures are
1914,
fortified.
it's complicated, but if you go back to, say, 1918, at the time of the Russian Revolution, it's not like the communists knew that their attempt to bring about a socialist utopia would be doomed to absolute murderous catastrophe, right? They were working in ignorance. Now, it's not that simple, because by that time Dostoevsky had already written The Devil, The Possessed, and he outlined very, very clearly what he thought would happen if people like that got the reins of power. And Nietzsche had done the same thing in his writing. So people knew that there was something toxic, let's say, and deadly about the doctrine, but it hadn't been played out on the world stage. But now, it's like, well, this is why I
Oh,
said
they
what
took
I
out
said
the
at
enemy's
beginning.
middle tower.
Fine. You know, if
Oh man, oh.
I don't know
So
exactly
happy
how to
about
make
all
the
that.
moral distinction, but it's a distinction that has to be made. I think that people who apologize, who say something like, I think that it's virtually, I don't know if
And we
it's
get
as
having small
reprehensible
recruits from
to
that
say
side.
that a given ethnic group should be consigned to the fire,
say it was a
and to
threat.
say that wasn't real communism, but they're damn close. And when I hear someone say that
Could
wasn't
be if
real
you're into that.
communism, I know what they mean. What they mean was, if I was the dictator in Stalin's shoes, I personally would have brought in the utopia. That's what that statement means. And, or it means an ignorance of history that's so utterly appalling that that any political statement made on behalf of that person whatsoever should immediately be followed by a paroxysm of extreme embarrassment.
I just want to be clear that these students were conceding that they don't agree, that they share your critique of
They,
the.
they don't share it enough.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I just wanted to make that clear. So they would more or less agree with what you just said, I think, about it's not okay to say that those regimes weren't proper communism and that proper communism should be tried. They still dispute that socialism as an
double kill.
ideology is on par with
Killing spree. Whoa.
So I just
Well, we could say
triple
communism, let's say. We could say radical leftist ideology. As I said already, there are reasons for the left and the right wing, right? The right wing stands for hierarchy, and the left wing stands for those who are displaced by hierarchy, right? An endless problem. But that doesn't mean, that still leaves it in the camp of the people speaking on behalf of egalitarianism to figure out just what the hell went wrong and to take some responsibility for it. You know, it's no joke. And we see these things play out continually. Still, look at what happened to Venezuela. Here's a funny story. Do you know that it is now illegal for physicians to list starvation as the cause of death for a Venezuelan child in a hospital? That's how they're dealing with the fact of starvation, right? You make it illegal to have that diagnosed as the cause of death. That'll solve the problem.
Oh, I can't
It's
believe
like,
it.
you
Whatever.
know, we have a group of well-meaning socialists in Canada who just produced something called the LEAP Manifesto a couple of years ago, and it's a pretty radical. It's a pretty radical document. They're trying to move our Socialist Party, the NDP, New Democratic Party, towards the acceptance of this LEAP Manifesto, which doesn't look like it's going to happen. But they were all radical promoters of the Venezuelan government before everything went like badly sideways. You know, I think the average Venezuelan now has lost 17 pounds. And that's not because they were put on a voluntary dieting program, right? It's not good. And so if you're tilting towards the left, and you're temperamentally inclined that way, and half the population is, then you have an ethical problem on your hands, which is how do you segregate yourself from the radical policies that produced the catastrophes of the 20th century? And you can't just say, well, that's not my problem. It's like, well, okay, if it's not your problem now, it certainly might become your problem in the future. So, and I would say it's actually everybody's problem. In the aftermath of the 20th century, it's everybody's problem. So it's complicated. Like, there is a genuine desire. Like, I worked for a socialist party for quite a while when I was a kid. You know, and I saw both sides of it. I saw some very, very admirable people. I was privy to the leadership of the socialist party. Well, the provinces, some of the provinces who ran the party. And a lot of them were really admirable people. Like, they spent their whole life, I would say, working on behalf of the working class. They were genuine labor leaders. And there was also a lot done in Canada on the left. It looked like it was actually pretty good. Standard work week, the introduction of our healthcare system, which I would say probably overall works better than the American system, although not at the upper end. And they were working hard on behalf because you had working class life. But then I also encountered the sort of low-level activist types, and I didn't have any respect for them at all. I just thought they were peevish and resentful and irritable. And those two things exist in a very uneasy coalition on the West. There's care for the poor and hatred for the successful, and those two things aren't the same at all. And it looks to me like one of the things that really happened when the communist doctrines were brought into play, and it also, by the way, we did the multinational experiment, right? It doesn't matter where you put these policies into play, the same outcome occurs. It didn't matter whether it was Russia or China or Cambodia or Vietnam, or pick a random African country, or Cuba or Venezuela for that matter. It was an unmitigated catastrophe. And so to me, that's experiment plus replication. Enough. Enough. Well, that has to be dealt with. And it's not, and the intellectual left in the West has been absolutely appalling in their silence on the communist catastrophe. Like, for my students, a lot of my students really haven't heard about anything that happened in the Soviet Union in any detail until they take my personality class in the second year of university. It's like, well, what the hell? Why are they learning about that in a personality class in the second year of university? That's not, that should be first and foremost in their historical knowledge what happened in the 20th century. I mean, it's almost fatal what happened, and we still haven't completely recovered from it, right? I think, isn't your president, Donald Trump, going to talk to, like, insane totalitarian #1 sometime here in the near future? If that's still a Soviet-era state, those people are armed to the teeth. You know, they have the weapon, they have weaponry that could easily take you out. And so we're not, I don't know if you know what happens if you blast a single hydrogen bomb 100 miles above the United States? Just one. You lose all your electronics. Right, they're all done. Tractors, cars, trains, subways, computers, phones, all of them burn out. And that's it. So we're not done with this yet. And the Korean state, North Korea, as an emblematic representative of the communist catastrophe. Everyone there starves. There's millions of people died 20 years ago. It's not got any better. So it's not like we solved this problem. And there's a deafening silence on the intellectual side of the spectrum with regards to what happened on the egalitarian left. And there's no excuse for it.
Somewhat relatedly, I think it's fair to say that even though you have criticized segments of both the left, social justice warriors, and the right, the alt-right, the critical commentary over the last year and a half has focused significantly more on the left than on the right. A lot of people I've talked to here at Lafayette, they say that we're so far from a Marxist takeover of our culture and political institutions that to suggest otherwise is to engage in a classic kind of right-wing exaggeration of hysteria we've seen before in Western countries in the 20th century. also say, and this is important to them, that the nationalist totalitarian right poses more of a threat to the individual than the left does, as it has in the West since the early 20th century. They argue that the left may have sway in the academy and large segments of the media, but nationalist right parties, figures, and movements with authoritarian tendencies have risen, become potent, and often been victorious in recent years. And they point to Trump, Brexit, the National Front.
Pointing to Trump is rather pointless. I mean, I don't know what Trump is, but I think of him as a figure of the radical right is a little on the absurd side. So, I mean, we are polarized, and so God only knows where the ultimate danger will come from. If it's the ethno-nationalists on the right, or if it's the radical leftists on the left, who knows, right? I suspect to some degree that's a matter of happenstance. I mean, that's what we'd expect if you looked at 20th century history. But I emerged out of the academy, and the academy, like, there aren't right-wing people in the academy, not to speak of. That's thoroughly documented. And it's certainly not the case in a country like Canada. There's no threat whatsoever in Canada from the radical right. It's like, I don't know, if you rounded up everybody who was on the radical right in Canada, you might be able to scrape up like, what, 3,000 or 4,000 people. You really, like, if you really worked at it, you know. So I just don't see that, at least in my own country. That's just a non-issue. It's a non-starter. I mean, the last time there was any kind of radical right-wingers in Canada was probably in Quebec in the 1950s. Maybe from the 1930s to the 1950s, but it's never been a political issue.
What about the AFD or the Italian, I can't remember the name of the Italian party, the National Front in France? Where would you put, would you?
Oh, well, I mean, in Europe, there's more polarization. Europeans also have, you know, they've been struggling with the consequences of Europe is different, and I would say there is more movement and activity on the right. So, but, and you know, I'm not an admirer of identity politics, and that's one of the reasons I wrote it to begin with. I think that you have to decide conceptually, psychologically, familially, and socially what your vision of a human being is. And if your vision of a human being is essentially tribal, so that you're defined by your collective identity in some manner, then you're going to play identity politics on the left, you're going to play identity politics on the right. It's like, well, I think the identity politics types on the left pose a bigger threat in my country. It's not so obvious in your country because you guys, your political landscape is more balanced, I would say, than ours. If the radical right posed a threat to the academy, which they most decidedly do not, then I would be just as upset about that. And so I think, again, it's part and parcel of the radical left's failure to take, or the left's in general, failure to take responsibility for the radicals. It's like, oh, well, why aren't you criticizing equally on both sides? Well, the threat doesn't exist equally on both sides, not in my country. So I think identity politics is a murderous game no matter who plays it, you know. And on the left, it's, well, we've already talked about that, so what's wrong on the right? Well, you stand up and wave your flag and talk about your ethnic identity or your racial identity, and you take pride in that. It's like, what the hell did that have to do with you, you goddamn loser? You know? It's like, you're one of the great heroes of the past, are you? That's why you're standing up and waving your flag. It's, no, you're not. You're identifying with your group because you don't have anything of your own to offer. And so it's pathetic. And I've said that many times, and in my lectures too, and people know this if they've actually watched my university lectures. I spend a tremendous amount of time, and have for 30 years, convincing my students that if they had been in Nazi Germany, there was a very high probability that rather than being Oskar Schindler and rescuing the Jews, they would have been a Nazi persecutor. Because there's like 5 Oskar Schindlers and like many million Nazis. So you can do the math for yourself. And if you don't think that, if you think that you would have been one of the few heroes, then you're either someone truly remarkable, or you're unbelievably deluded. And so I would suspect that you're in the unbelievably deluded camp, because truly remarkable people are rare. And I've really seen this in the last year or two, because one of the things I have noted, like I knew that people were timid, you know, and I knew why. It's dangerous to stick your head up above the rest. I mean, it's predator avoidance strategy to keep your head down. And I mean that technically, it truly is. To blend in with the crowd is a predator avoidance strategy. That's what fish do in schools of fish. Like, it's very low-level behavior. And if you stick your head up, there's some real danger. And the advantage to that is that people are pretty civilized and they go along with the group, and that's a good thing, because, you know, we should be civilized and go along with the group, but it's a really bad thing when the group goes sideways. And I've had many people, colleagues, but many other people too, say, well, really, we agree with what you're doing, but we can't really take the risk of standing up and saying so. It's like, well, now and then, so most people fall into that camp. When I went to Queen's University a month ago and was subject to that chilling demonstration, I would say, where the radicals climbed up into the stained glass window wells and pounded, you know, unendingly for 90 minutes while we were all inside. I had a professor write me the day before and say, look, my wife and I work at the university. We really support what you're doing, but we can't even risk coming to the talk, because what if the students see and complain? It's like, well, yeah, there's courage for you, man. There's courage for you, you know. And so, but that's par for the course, and it's unsurprising to some degree. But, well, but anyways, on the right, it's like, it's an excuse by people on the left not to take the things that I'm saying seriously. That's what it is. It's like, well, he's not attacking the right as much. It's like, well, they're not after me. They're not trying to close down my speech. So I took that personally. So had it been right-wingers coming after me, well, it would have been the same thing. So it's a foolish objection, I think.
For decades, ethnic groups have, on average, scored significantly differently on IQ tests. According to psychology professor Richard Hare, whom you interviewed on your channel, YouTube, there is no scientific consensus on the causes of these average differences in IQ test scores. Yet, according to Hare, psychologists do generally agree that general intelligence exists, that IQ measures it well and in a non-culturally biased way, that IQ is highly predictive of success in educational and professional terms, and that for decades, ethnic groups have, on average, scored significantly differently. So assuming this is true, should we talk about it? Sam Harris raised this question in a podcast conversation with Charles Murray. Some argue that we should not talk about this, as doing so could fuel the racial supremacist movements that you mentioned, with potentially horrific consequences. Others, mainly on the intellectual dark web, and to a very limited extent in academia, think we should talk about this topic, because average differences in IQ scores have existed for decades. They may have played a role in generating the disparate educational and professional outcomes that we observe and care about, and thus that we cannot properly analyze these disparate outcomes unless we do talk about this subject openly. Geneticist David Reich recently argued in the New York Times that if scientists do not openly discuss the biological basis of race, pseudoscientists could fill the vacuum with dangerous consequences. Furthermore, you, Professor Peterson, are highly critical of the oppression narrative that permeates segments of the academy and activist left. And knowledge about average differences in IQ scores between ethnic groups, while tough to assimilate, could puncture this narrative. So the question is, what is your view on all that I've just said?
Jesus, you guys really did take a long time to prepare these questions, didn't you? All right, so when I went to Harvard, I came from McGill, and I had spent a lot of time with my advisor there and a research team that he had, trying to understand the genesis of and among adolescents mostly. So, well, as kids as well. Antisocial behavior is very persistent. So if you have a child who's conduct disordered at the age of 4, the probability
turn
that
to
they will be
ban,
criminal
dummy.
at the age of 15 or 20 is extremely high. It's unbelievably stable. It's a very dismal literature
5 seconds
because
left now.
you see these early onset aggressive kids and it's persistent. And then you look at the intervention literature and you throw up your hands because no interventions work. And believe me, psychologists have tried everything you could possibly imagine and a bunch of things that you can't in order to ameliorate that. So we were really interested in trying to understand, for example, if you're antisocial by the age of 4, then there isn't an intervention that seems to be effective. So, and the standard penological
hello, it's your
theory is
turn to
really
pick.
quite horrifying in this regard because what you see is that male aggression peaks around the age of 15 and then it declines fairly precipitously and sort of
Your turn to pick,
normalizes
bro.
again by the age of 27. And standard penological theory essentially is this cold-hearted. It's like if you have someone who's a multiple offender, you just throw them in prison until they're 27. Then they age out of it. And that's all there is to it. That's what we've got. Now there's some downside to that because there's a corollary literature that suggests that the worst thing that you can do with antisocial people is to group them together, which is what we do in prisons. So that's a whole mess. Anyways, one of the things we were doing was trying to see if there might be cognitive predictors of antisocial behavior. And so we used this battery of neuropsychological tests that was put together at the Montreal Neurological Institute. Took about 11 hours to administer and hypothetically assessed prefrontal cortical function.
Turn to pick.
And we computerized that, reduced it to about 90 minutes, and then assessed antisocial adolescents
turn to pick.
in Montreal and found out that they did show deficits in problem-solving ability that we associated with prefrontal ability. When I got to Harvard, I thought, well, that's interesting. We could use the neuropsych battery to predict negative behavior. Perhaps we could use it to predict positive behavior. So I thought, well, what if we turned the neuropsych battery and over and thought, well, can we predict grades, for example? Because that's a decent thing to predict. So we ran a study. We ran a study that looked at Harvard kids, University of Toronto kids, line workers at a Milwaukee factory, and managers and executives at the same factory. And what we found was that the average score across these neuropsychological tests, they were kind of like games. They were game-like, So in one test, there were 5 lights in the middle of the screen, and a box was associated with each light, and you had to learn by trial and error which box was associated with each light. That was one of the tests. So we took people's average score across the tests because they seemed to clump together into a single structure. You can find that out statistically. If you take a bunch of tests, you can find out how they clump together statistically by looking at their patterns of correlations. And you might get multiple clumps, which is what happens with personality research, where you get 5, or you might get a singular clump, which is what happens in cognitive research. And we got a single clump, essentially. And then we were trying to figure out if, at the same time, I was reading the literature on performance prediction. And there's an extensive literature on performance prediction, a lot of it generated by the armed forces, by the way,
I know more than you.
indicating that IQ is a very good predictor of long-term life success. And so here's the general rule. If your job is simple, which means you do the same thing every day, then IQ predicts how fast you'll learn the job, but not how well you do it. But if your job is complex, which means that the demands change on an ongoing basis, then the best predictor of success is general cognitive ability. And I learned that the general cognitive ability tests clump together into a single factor. That's fluid intelligence, or IQ. And then we didn't know if the factor that we had found was the same factor as IQ. Yes. And we still haven't really figured out whether or not that was the case, because it kind of depends on how you do the analysis. But anyways, I got deeply into the performance prediction literature, and I found out, well, if you want to predict people's performance in life, there's a couple of things you need to know. You need to know their general cognitive ability if they're going to do a complex job. You need to know their trait conscientiousness. Some of you might have heard that rebranded as grit in a very corrupt act, by the way, because it's a good predictor of long-term life success. Freedom from negative emotion, low neuroticism, is another predictor, but it's sort of third on the hierarchy. And then openness to experience, which is a personality trait, is associated with expertise in creative domains. The evidence that, now I should tell you, this is such a complicated question, I should tell you how to make an IQ test. It's actually really easy. And you need to know this to actually understand what IQ is. So imagine that you generated a set of 10,000 questions, okay, about anything. They could be math problems, they could be general knowledge, they could be vocabulary, they could be multiple choice. It really doesn't matter what they're about as long as they require abstraction to solve. So they'd be formulated linguistically, but mathematically would also apply. And then you have those 10,000 questions. Now you take a random set of 100 of those questions and you give them to 1,000 people, and all you do is sum up the answers, right? So some people are going to get most of them right, and some of them are going to get most of them wrong. You just rank order the people in terms of their score. Correct that for age and you have IQ. That's all there is to it. And what you'll find is that no matter which random set of 100 questions you take, the people at the top of one random set will be at the top of all the others. And with very, very, very high consistency. So one thing you need to know is that if any social science claims whatsoever are correct, then the IQ claims are correct. Because the IQ claims are more psychometrically rigorous than any other phenomenon that's been discovered by social scientists. Now, IQ literature is a dismal literature. No one likes it. Here's why. Here's an example. So here's a fun little fact for you, for liberals and conservatives alike. Because conservatives think there's a job for everyone. People just get off their asses and get to work. And liberals think, well, you can train anyone to do anything. It's like, no, there isn't a job for everyone. And no, you can't train everyone to do everything. That's wrong. And here's one of the consequences of that. So as I mentioned, the armed forces has done a lot of work on IQ, and they started back in 1919. And the reason they did that was because, well, for obvious reasons. Let's say there's a war, and you want to get qualified people into the officer positions as rapidly as possible, or you'll lose. So that's a reason. Now, the armed forces has experimented with IQ tests since 1919, and in the last 20 years, a law was passed as a consequence of that analysis, which was that it was illegal to induct anyone into the armed forces who had an IQ of less than 83. Now the question is why? And the answer was, all of that effort put in by the armed forces indicated that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there wasn't anything that you could be trained to do in the military that wasn't positively counterproductive. Now you got to think about that, because the military is chronically desperate for people, right? It's not like people are lining up to be inducted, right? They have to go out and recruit, and it's not easy. And so they're desperate to get their hands on every body they can possibly manage. And then, especially in wartime, but also in peacetime. But then there was another reason too, which was the armed forces was also set up from a policy perspective to take people in the underclass, let's say, and train them and move them up at least into the working class or maybe the middle class. So there's a policy element to it too. And so even from that perspective, you can see that the military is desperate to bring people in. But well, with an IQ of 83 or less, it's not happening. Okay, so how many people have an IQ of 83 or less? 10%. Now, if that doesn't hurt you to hear, then you didn't hear it properly. Because what it implies is that in a complex society like ours, and one that's becoming increasingly complex, there isn't anything for 10% of the population to do. All right, well, what are we going to do? We're going to ignore that? We're going to run away from that? And believe me, we have every reason to. Or we're going to contend with the fact that we need to figure out how it might be possible to find a place for people on the lower end of the general cognitive distribution to take their productive and worthwhile place in society. And that isn't just going to be a matter of dumping money down the hierarchy, because giving people who have nothing to do money isn't helpful. It doesn't work. It's not that simple. Well, so that's kind of an answer to the question of whether or not we should deal with IQ forthrightly. Like, if you can find a flaw in that logic, like, just go right ahead. It's not like I was thrilled to death to discover all of this. By no stretch of the imagination was that the case. So what? So IQ is reliable and valid. That's the first thing. It's more reliable and valid than any other psychometric test ever designed by social scientists by a factor of about 3. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2 is it predicts long-term life outcome. at about 0.3, 0.4, which leaves about 85%, 70 to 85% of the story unexplained, but it's still the best thing that we have. Well, it's also the case that in places like Great Britain, when IQ tests were first introduced, they were actually used by the socialists, and they were used to identify poor people who had potential, cognitive potential, and to move them into institutes of higher education. So there's an upside, you know, a social upside as well. Ethnic differences.
But geez, Rick, the top tower
This is something you can't say anything about without immediately being killed. So I'm hesitant to broach the topic. But I'll tell you one thing that I did in the last week that's relevant to this. And this just shows you how complex the problem is. First of all, we should point out that race is a very difficult thing to define because racial boundaries aren't tight, right? So when you talk about racial differences in IQ, you're faced with the thorny problem of defining race. And that's a big problem from a scientific perspective. But we'll leave that aside. And I wrote an article this week. Somebody stood up at one point in one of my talks, and Vice, bless their hearts, took this particular question and used it as an indication of the quality of the people who are my so-called followers. And by the way, the quality of my so-called followers is pretty damn high. And you can find that out quite rapidly just by looking at the YouTube comments, which are head and shoulders above the standard set of YouTube comments, I can tell you that. So someone asked me about the Jewish question, right? And the implication, it was actually someone Jewish, and the implication was that Jews are overrepresented in positions of authority and power. And I had just spoken for like an hour and a half. And, you know, this guy had an axe to grind, and I thought, there's no goddamn way I'm getting into this at the moment. And so I said I can't answer that question. But that's not a very good answer. So I wrote a blog post this week and said, look, here's the situation. All right. Jews are overrepresented in positions of power and authority. But then let's open our eyes a little bit, eh? And think for like 2 or 3 seconds and think, hey, guess what? They're also overrepresented in positions of competence. And it's not like we have more geniuses than we know what to do with. And if the Jews happen to be producing more of them, which they are, by the way, then that's a pretty good thing for the rest of us. So let's not confuse competence with power and authority, even though that's a favorite trick of the radical leftists, who always fail to make that distinction. Well, why does this overrepresentation occur? Because it does. There's also overrepresentation in political movements, including radical political movements. Okay, why? Well, answer 1, Jewish conspiracy. Okay, that's not a very good answer. We've used that answer before. All right, but do we have an alternative? Well, here's an alternative. The average Ashkenazi IQ is somewhere between 110 and 160, which is about 1 standard deviation above the population average. And so what that means is that the average Ashkenazi / European Jew has an IQ that's higher than 85% of the population. That's a lot higher. Now, that doesn't make that much difference in the middle of the distribution, okay? But geniuses don't exist at the middle of the distribution. They exist at the tails of the distribution. And you don't need much of a move at the mean to produce walloping differences at the tails. And the tails are important because a lot of where we draw exceptional people from the exceptions, right? So here's another example of the same thing. Most engineers are male. Why?
Oh boy,
Because men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And you might say, well, that's sociocultural. It's like, no, it's not. And we know that because if you stack up countries by their egalitarian social policies, which you can do quite effectively, and then you look at the overrepresentation of men in STEM fields, the overrepresentation increases as the countries become more egalitarian. So it's not sociocultural. Okay, now men aren't that much more interested in things than women. It's 1 standard deviation, which is about the same difference, by the way, between the population norm and the Ashkenazi Jews. But if you're looking at the 1 person in 20 or the 1 person in 50 who's hyper interested in things and thus likely to become an engineer, then most of them are men. Here's another example of the same thing. Men are more aggressive than women. Now, you might ask, how much? And the answer to that, the best place to look at that is in Sweden, where the egalitarian policies have been laid out for a long period of time, and you can get a more direct inference about biology. If you took a random man and a random woman out of the population, and you had to bet on who was more aggressive, and you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. So that's not that much, right? It deviates from 50-50, but it's not like 90-10, it's 60-40. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, we got a tail problem here. Again, let's say that now you decide to go out onto the extremes of aggression and you identify the most aggressive 1 in 100 persons. They're all men. Guess who's in prison? Those people. That's why most of the people in prison are men. And so this is elementary. Part of the problem in our society is that we don't understand statistics. We don't understand that you can have relatively small differences at the population level that produce walloping consequences at the tails of the distribution. Okay, so back to IQ. One final thing to say about IQ. The ethnic differences are difficult to dispense with. It's not easy to make them go away. You can say, well, the tests aren't culture fair. Well, here's a test of that. So imagine you test group A with an IQ test and you test group B with an IQ test. And then you look at their actual performance in whatever you're predicting. If the test was biased against ethnic group A, then it would underpredict their performance. And that doesn't happen. Now you could say, well, there's systemic bias in the performance measures and the potential measures, and that's a possibility. All right. Now, one other thing about that. There's a real danger in the ethnicity IQ debate, and the danger is
I love that you guys came bottom, but can you not take just every last hit after that?
Or that we confuse intelligence with human value. That's a better way of thinking about it. And one of the things that we're going to have to understand here is that that's a mistake, is that being more intelligent doesn't make you a better person. That's not the case. It makes you more useful for complex cognitive operations, but you can be pretty damn horrific as a genius son of a bitch, right? It's morally neutral, and we also know that from the psychometric data, by the way. There doesn't seem to be any relationship whatsoever between intelligence and virtue. And so, if it does turn out that nature and the fates do not align with our egalitarian presuppositions, which is highly probable, we shouldn't therefore make the mistake of assuming that if group A or person A is lower on one of these attributes than group B or person B, that is somehow reflective of the intrinsic value as human beings. That's a big mistake.
Oh, the enemy's middle tower's gone. Serves them right.
Oh boy, Morty, there's some pretty fantastic stuff happening right here.
So,
I was lucky.
I had 3 more questions, and so maybe slightly shorter answers to these 3, like maybe around.
Well, hopefully they're simpler questions.
You know,
Rick, I got
average 5 minutes,
okay.
maybe. And then we will open it up. So, another taboo is to celebrate European
bottom tower's under attack.
When you TP there, Pudge, you're not
get
hidden
pretty
to know.
unhappy when
can see it.
Europeans start expressing pride in their culture or heritage. Many, especially on the left, do not draw much of a distinction, at least in practice, between European pride and white supremacy. You care about freedom of the individual's freedom to think, to speak, to associate, in short, to act as he sees fit without external compulsion, as long as he doesn't influence. Professor Ricardo Duchesne, a historical sociologist and professor at the University of New Brunswick, argues that, quote, individualism is a unique attribute of European peoples. Quote, it has been exported to some degree to other nations, but in my view, it is not something that comes to them naturally. So, he continues, quote, you can't play the game of we're all individuals. We have to affirm and be proud of our ethnic identity. To preserve the West's curious
That's what I call teamwork.
If Europeans become minorities in the West, he argues, the founding idea of the West, that no entity, not an individual, not a community, not the state,
You know,
can
Morty, it
justly
sometimes
deprive
feels like
an
they don't even
individual
care.
of life, liberty, or property by force, no matter what the individual's race,
Got your
class,
top
or
tower's
religion.
under attack.
I wouldn't be surprised if Hussein, when he made this
not
statement,
good.
had you in mind.
Look, the medieval Europeans identified 7 deadly sins for a reason. And one of them was pride.
Your top
Let's
tower's under
make this
attack.
right. I do believe
Dominating
that
now. He's dominating.
for reasons that aren't obvious, that the West has
Got
got
your
some
top
things right.
tower's under attack.
We've got the sovereignty of the individual right. That's the most fundamental thing we've got right. We've articulated that, I think, in a remarkable way, not only theologically, philosophically, in our body of laws, in our society. And one of the consequences of that, as it's had its effect on the rest of the world, is that everyone is getting richer quite fast. And that's a really good thing. Okay, having said that, it's like, am I proud of that? It's like, I didn't do that.
With a will.
What the hell? Pride. What's that? That's not the right response. How about responsibility for that? How would that be? It's like you're part of this great and unlikely set of propositions, this strange set of propositions that says that in some ineffable manner, the poorest person is as valuable as the king. It's like, how the hell did we ever figure that out? That's an impossible thing to think, and yet that's the bedrock of our legal system. That's nothing to be proud of. That's something to tremble before, to take on as an ethical burden, and not to wave a flag for how wonderful you are that you happen to have the same skin color as some of the people who thought that up.
You know, Rick, I gotta
It's
tell
not
you,
the
my
right
bottom
response.
tower is looking
It's like
pretty good.
it's to open your eyes and recognize that as a miracle, and a relatively new miracle on the world stage, and to participate in the process of upholding that in your personal and your public life. That's not pride in European tradition. Like when I go to Europe, and I love going to Europe, and the European cities they're unbelievable masterpieces, which is why they're completely flooded by pilgrims, right? Tourists, pilgrims, who go there to look at the beauty. It's like, I don't feel pride about that. I feel like I have something to live up to. That's not the same thing, man. And so these right-wingers in this, it's like, look what we've done. It's like, no, it's not you that did that. That's something, man. You gotta have your act together before you would dare to say, well, that was me. It's like, yeah, sure it was you. Yeah, right. No, that's hard to stand up and take your place in that kind of historical process, that unlikely, miraculous historical process. Not to just feel ashamed at the way that you're presently constituted in the face of that means that you're deluded, and you're using your great fortune of being a beneficiary of that system. Look at what we've got here, this great peace that we're inhabiting right now. You're using your the unearned gift that's been granted to you as a source of personal pride in your accomplishments due to your skin. It's like, no, not good, not a good argument. So, and that doesn't mean that, well, there's nothing valuable about European culture. There's plenty about it that's valuable. It's not even so clear to what degree it's European. I mean, it came out of the Middle East, you know? I mean, who? It's so muddle-headed that you hardly know where to start. Hopefully that's good. There we go. Dispensed with the radical right-wingers in 4 minutes.
You have to turn in fighter, dude. You can't run away from a drone, man.
What do you mean?
We should start calling this person
Are
triple
you talking to
kill,
me or
'cause they
fucking
got a
Pudge?
triple kill.
No, Pudge, man. Why would I be
Okay.
talking to you?
I don't know,
You're out
because
of
I was
this.
talking to
As they
fucking...
did in
I was talking to
traditional
fucking
European
Shadow,
societies,
who should have
and
put Ricky in a
obviously
bubble
as they
but
do
stood
in
there.
much of the Muslim world today. Related
It's like I'm desperately fighting this fucking Ricky. No, you put fucking... What do you mean? You didn't put him at all. put fucking Drow in it. He put Drow in the bubble. I wanted fucking Ricky in the bubble because he was kicking my ass.
Middle and upper classes is alive and well in the Muslim
It's like I armor toggled at the last second and got some more HP. Please put him in the bubble so I can run away.
Leads me to believe the Dire fortified their structure.
Man,
you might as well save that energy because Radiant just fortified their structure.
From life's elemental realities. You've said it is extraordinarily naive to believe that the differences between European culture and Islamic culture are not about anything fundamental. You've expressed concern that Islam is a totalizing system, and in a quote that stood out to me, you said in a Patreon chat on YouTube that in your view, quote, the only countries in the world that are essentially worth living in any real sense, are the ones that are predicated on the Judeo-Christian tradition and manifested in the Western body of laws. Unquote. So an open-ended question. How would you synthesize your perspective on Islam and the fact that the Muslim populations of Europe and Canada, a product of recent immigration, are growing and reproducing much faster than the European descended populations of these countries?
Yeah, and you guys really did spend a lot of time coming up with troublesome questions, didn't you? See, the problem is, one of the problems is that I'm an ignorant man, and there's lots of things that I don't know. And I don't understand Islam. I don't know enough about it I've done my best to heck away at it. It would require multiple years of study to understand the similarities and differences between the two groups.
You might want to kiss your bottom tower goodbye.
Looks to me
it's gone.
like what Islam did was take a group of radically disparate tribes and unite them under a single ethos. Of course, the Muslim civilization expanded more rapidly than any other civilization ever had, and occupied a very large part of the world, which
I want to ask, if blood couldn't hit the tower, how was I supposed
Perhaps
to really?
there's something to be said for that unifying tendency.
Draw upon your strength.
Oh, your bottom tower's under attack.
Boy, fresh mate.
Oh my gosh, Morty. He's from
There's a
Rotterdam
problem.
because he's wicked sick.
Your bottom tower's under
And maybe
attack.
this is at the core of the problem.
Yeah, I get that, but blood didn't
no
hit it on the way back either, because he knew what I knew, I imagine.
Islam.
Because we're in the middle of kind of still a fight going on, and one wrong move could fuck us.
It isn't obvious to me if it's the case that our culture is grounded in an underlying, let's call it literary metaphysics, something like that, a religious metaphysics. Part of the bedrock of our culture is the idea of the separation between church and state. And as far as I can tell, that idea doesn't exist in the Muslim world. And so I cannot understand how that faith is commensurate with the institutions of the West. It doesn't seem to me that there's any evidence that it's commensurate, because the number of Islamic democracies is, let's call it, finite. The best example has probably been Turkey. And Turkey, as far as I can tell, isn't doing that well at the moment on the democratic front. And it looked like the great shining hope. And a lot of that was a consequence of secularization.
You shall risk it.
You know, I've spent a lot of time, when I was writing Maps of Meaning, for example, looking for commonalities among religious viewpoints. And I was able to find deep commonalities, I thought, between Buddhism and Christianity, and Taoism and Christianity, and Hinduism and Christianity, for that matter. It was a lot harder when it came to Islam. It's not a faith that's opened itself up to me. I don't understand it well.
I'll give it my all. In strength, is healing.
But I hope
We might want to just get back. There's like 4 of them up here.
goodwill can build a bridge between the two cultures, because the alternative is too gloomy to contemplate.
Yes.
And finally, you've stated, quote, women are more agreeable by nature than men. and agreeable people are compassionate toward those they see as suffering. And that seems to include any minority, especially when you combine that with a kind of neo-Marxist doctrine that claims that anyone who has an advantage swiped it, unquote. Women have been voting for a century now, and this, you suggested in a Patreon chat, may help to explain why, in the West, we've collectively decided that, quote, egalitarianism and conflict avoidance constitute the two highest virtues and trump everything else, including free speech, unquote. You've said that in the West today, you're perhaps for the first time in history seeing on the political left, or on segments of the political left, quote, what a female totalitarianism would look like, unquote. Elaborate.
We did a research project with students. We haven't published it.
This is a day to remember. There was a monster kill.
Preoccupied. So those are the two barriers at the moment. But the first thing we wanted to do was to find out whether there was actually such a thing as political correctness.
Morty,
you can actually do that
better hold on to your hat.
science. So what we did, this is what we did. We got a group of people together and we collected a whole bunch of statements that seemed to be vaguely associated with the idea of political correctness. Maybe you could think, well, it's a media construct, and that's fine. You can go analyze media statements, and then you can collect ideas that seem to be associated with whatever political correctness is. We collected about 400 of those. And then we turned them into questions, and we asked 1,000 people for their opinions. Then you can do this statistical process called
that
factor
an infinite
analysis.
illusion or
it's
what?
the same thing that pulls out a single
that looks
factor
infinite
of IQ
in
from
terms
a
of
group
time.
questions, for example. It's the same thing that produced the big 5 personality models.
It's literally going up. It has
does is
negative
tell you
40 duration. I don't understand this.
if questions grouped together. So let's say
Yeah, but why isn't it an illusion that lasts forever?
There's 100 of you. Everyone who has opinion A also has opinion B and opinion C. And if that's the case, then those clump together. There's something about them that's the same. Now, what we could have found was that when we analyzed these 400 questions, there was like 50 clumps. And so that would have blown there's such a thing as political correctness hypothesis out of the water. But that isn't what happened. We found 2 clumps, one of which looked like something like moderate leftism and the other that looked
nice
very
shot,
much
buddy.
like totalitarian political correctness. And it was a very, very robust finding. And we replicated it as well. She did this for her master's thesis. And then we looked at what predicted these beliefs. First of all, the correlation between the moderate leftist clump of questions and the radical leftist clump of questions actually wasn't very high. And so
she has
one
too
of
much
the things
HP
that
right
we
now.
surmised is that there's an actual division on the left between the moderates and the radicals. And that's just not played itself out. And I think you can actually see that happening by the proclivity of the radical leftists to devour themselves.
Especially if he goes all Wex.
Right, so which happens on a very regular basis. Or perhaps you can see it in the proclivity of the radical leftists to go after the moderates.
Even faster with the drums of endurance, as you state.
Whatever. So there's
even
2
faster with the drums
clumps
of endurance, as you state.
Both of them were predicted by trait agreeableness, which is one of the traits that women score higher on than men. It's the antithesis of aggression. And also by being female, which was a real shock to us because most of the... So let's say females and males differ with regards to some outcome. You try to figure out why that is. It might be just because they're female, but there's all sorts of things associated with being female or male that are like second-order complications. What we found almost invariably with the personality literature is if you look at differences between men and women and then you control for personality, the differences go away. So they're not differences between men and women per se, they're differences between personality. But with political correctness, we found an effect of agreeableness, which was a pure personality effect, and an effect of being female. So we also found a pronounced effect of having taken at least one seminar that was politically correct in its orientation. So that had a walloping effect. So there does seem to be something about political, according to that research. I try to rely on better research, but none has been done. So that's the best that I've got. And the woman who did this research is very, very smart, and the study was well done. So I think it's credible. So, and one of the things that's interesting to me about that is that it does tie into the Freudian nightmare of the devouring mother, essentially, which is Freud's, I think, signal contribution to psychopathology. You know, for most of Freud's clients were people who were struggling to get out of the clutches of their family, right? And part of that is human beings are very dependent, right? Because we have this incredibly long period of development. 30 years maybe, but certainly 18 years. And so it's hard to struggle up from infancy, mature, and leave as an independent creature. And lots of people, you see this if you're a clinician, you see this all the time. People are so tangled up in their families that they can't leave. And that's the Oedipal situation that Freud described so brilliantly. And Jung also elaborated on it. A lot of that's a consequence of hyperdependence, right? It's the danger of overprotection. Now there's a rule if you're dealing with elderly people, say in an elderly care institution, and the rule is something like, don't do anything for your charges that they can do themselves. Kind of a harsh rule. You know, if you see somebody struggling with their buttons, maybe they're 3 years old, you want to rush over and help. It's like, well, maybe you don't, because they need to learn how to do up their damn buttons. Or if they're 85, they need to maintain their independence as much as possible without your compassion stealing it from them. Okay, well, we could hypothesize that there would be no pathology as a consequence of the female rights and political power. But given that females are human beings too, and we're pretty much rife with pathology, the probability that there'll be a downside is like there is to male participation, which would be more aggressive and competition. The probability that there would be a downside is extraordinarily high. Well, why wouldn't it be a downside associated with hyperprotectiveness? It's exactly what you'd expect. And then what you see playing out in the political landscape, as far as I can tell, and maybe I'm wrong, is wherever there's an inequality, there's an oppression narrative. And so anyone who stacks up at the bottom of the hierarchy is a victim/infant, and anyone at the top is an oppressor/predator. And I think confusing hierarchical structure, especially when it's based on competence, and Western structures of hierarchy are based in large part, although not entirely, on competence, confusing that with a predator-infant or oppressor-oppression relationship is a very bad idea. Now, having said that, it's obvious that every social structure has a tyrannical element. Like, nobody in their right mind is going to say, well, our cultural structures are 100% fair and just. Obviously they're not, and every single person in this room, and some far more than others, have been brutalized by the social structure, which takes you around the neck, shakes the hell out of you, and says, you better be like everyone else or else, right? That's the tyrannical aspect of the social structure. So you have to be naive not to think that there's some oppressor-oppression dynamic in a social structure, but to make that the only element of the discussion is extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, one of the things that looking at terrible things has done for me is make me a very grateful person. Like when I walk out on the street and I see that people aren't at each other's throats, I really think that that's a miracle. Like I was just in Manhattan for a week. You know, if your eyes are open, that place is an absolute miracle. I mean, there's way too many people there. 7 million people come in a day, right? There's way too many people. They're just stacked on top of each other. There's all these massive skyscrapers, and they all stand up. There they all standing up. All the traffic lights work. All the electricity works. The buildings aren't blowing up one after another because of natural gas leaks. They just don't blow up. And people aren't like beating each other to death with clubs in the street. It's like, so when I go outside in New York, I think, my God, how did we manage this? Because I'm a Hobbesian by nature. You know, I think,
Time is short.
and it's not like I'm entirely pessimistic, but I think that you're naive if you don't think that the natural state of human beings is one of brutality. All you have to do is look at history and you'd be convinced of that very rapidly. And so the fact that, look at us, we can all sit in here. We don't know each other. And we're having a contentious political discussion.
Yeah, I'm not trying that again.
And like, nothing
not
terrible is happening.
Let the 3 heroes next to that
then
deter
you're
me
way
for the
too
moment.
protected for your own good. So, well, so back to the,
Oh, geez,
back
your middle
to the
tower's
real
under attack.
Visibility.
There are tyrannies of care. The
Coming.
psychoanalyst said, good mothers tell us. And what that means is that when your kid is 3 years old,
You've got to get a BKB, blood.
making mistakes, you back the hell off. You let them make mistakes. And you don't view the world as infinite. You don't project that onto the political system. Because it's not a good idea.
Double kill.
Especially for those who you're misdiagnosing as predators.
Okay, so now we are going to open it up for Q&A.
All right, so the idea that I've put thought into this is an optimistic one, but as you might imagine, we've been a topic of conversation on this campus a lot in the past week or so, certainly among a lot of us in politics, and one of the things that sort of united people who like and dislike a lot of your ideas is that we appreciate your defensiveness.
Thank you.
But one of the things I thought was really interesting is Professor Van Dyke addressed the distinction between you and Jonathan Haidt. And you mentioned this as sort of a temperamental one. And I think, I'm sure that's true to some extent, but I noticed you made a lot of more sort of substantively inflammatory claims. Like, in the course of this lecture, you called the authors of Facebook posts demons and totalitarians. In past events, you called them things like neo-Marxists, cultural Marxists. You called them a fifth column that is treason against the West.
Hooray,
and this is more than temperamental. This is a substantive difference. And
It's substantive difference.
And another thing you've done is that, unlike Haidt, you have a more sort of comprehensive political program. You've talked a lot in defense of traditional hierarchies, both of gender, of class, so on, though emphatically not of race. And so it seems that
I haven't talked about defensive traditional hierarchies in terms of gender and class. That's not true.
Well, you've talked about hierarchies in society. You've talked
Yeah,
about
that's true. I have done that, but I haven't justified them on the basis of gender and class. Whatever it
well,
the
okay,
two categories.
you talk
Not
about,
okay. That's an important distinction.
Okay, but you defend hierarchies in society in a way that you talk a lot about yes?
That doesn't mean I defend it.
Well, okay.
No, not okay.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think
observing that something exists is not the same as defending it. How in the world?
Well, people attack it. Right?
What's that?
You don't. People attack it.
Attack what?
Attack the hierarchies of society as inherently.
Well, they're unjust, but they're also useful.
Okay, so you say they're useful.
Well, look at it this way. Okay, look at it this way. You obviously think that it's worthwhile to stand up and ask a question.
Yes.
So you think that standing up and asking a question is better than not standing up and asking a question.
Yes.
Okay, that's a hierarchy.
Yes.
Of values.
Yes.
Okay, without the hierarchy of values, you couldn't act.
Of course.
No, not of course.
Well, wait.
It's partly why I'm defending the hierarchy. Without a hierarchy, there's no impetus to act.
Hierarchy, right?
What's that?
There is a hierarchy in society, right?
No, there's multiple hierarchies in society.
There are multiple hierarchies in society, right?
Yeah.
And you say that they are based in, you invoke the lobster, right? That they are based in nature.
Yes. I said that they were inevitable.
Yes, that they were inevitable.
Some people that doesn't mean that they're good.
But my point is that, this is generally relative, you have a broader point than free speech. This is one of the things you talk about. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Whereas I think there are some other activists who focus on more exclusively.
I'm not an activist.
There are some other individuals who engage in public political speech. Okay.
Yeah?
Who focus more exclusively on free speech, whereas you have other goals in mind. But one of the things that your more inflammatory language, and to be fair, it's a substantive disagreement, has done, I think, is it's politicized this free speech to an extent that someone like Haidt hasn't. I've noticed that when someone hears the term free speech now, they associate it with a specific set of thinkers, often as viewed as on the extreme right. And I think arguably that's the problem of all factions in society, because free speech should be a universal value. Polls certainly suggest that it's coming under increasing threat from both sides. But I suppose the heart of my question, in addition, of course, these other observations, is that
like they don't even care.
Do you believe free speech is your primary enemy, or do you believe these other things are important? Because I've heard you a bunch of times defend free speech sort of contextually, like you've complained about some of the laws in Canada that you dislike, that they institutionalize false facts into law. But it seems to me that an absolutist defense of free speech makes no preference as to true or false. The point is that something you are being forced to say something. It would be bad if you were forced to say something that is true. Because the point of free speech is that you can say whatever you want, right?
No, the point of free speech is so that you can think your way through life without running like headlong into a brick wall.
Think position A versus position B is just as bad, right? Even if one is true and the other is not.
Okay, well, there was a bunch of questions.
Yes.
Good job, by the way.
Well, actually, wait, can I just ask one additional addendum? Which is, I think the politicization of free speech is by far the biggest threat to free speech, because this is always been...
No, the radical leftists are the biggest threat
Well,
to free
okay, so
speech.
this is a disagreement.
But I get your
As
point.
the professor alluded to in previous questions, the substantive threats to free speech in much of the world, in Europe certainly, I think in the United States as well, from the government has come from the rest of Russia. And I think it's fair to say that on a specific narrow subset of certain departments in liberal arts colleges, it's fair to say a threat nationally, though the scope is in dispute. But my question is, do you think that the way you talk about it, the way you talk about specific issues, the way you use inflammatory language, and the way you seem to make it, you seem to defend a specific set of, there are certainly plenty of instances of free speech attacked on the other side, but you don't mention it. Do you think that this is politicized? Because it seems to me that, okay, and do you not think that's a far greater threat? Because, for example, the NRA, well, sorry, the NRA is a group in the United States that defends it, right?
Okay, hold it.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, like I said, you're doing fine, but it's just too much. Like, I can't keep it straight.
Do you think that your behavior risks politicizing it, and do you think that politicization is justified?
I think my behavior risks politicizing it, yes. I would rather it not be politicized. And I'm doing what I can to manage that risk. However, it's become political in my country because the government implemented compelled speech legislation. So I wasn't complaining about that before it became political. Now, there is a time, even when you're detached,
I wasn't
in some sense
out
from
of
the
piss and
political
vinegar,
realm,
by the way.
You can't be detached anymore.
Like, I still have my satanic.
Now, I'm not happy with the fact that this has become politicized. You could say that I haven't done a stellar job in ensuring in every possible manner that this has remained neutrally apolitical. Probably true. But I'm not particularly unhappy with the way things have gone so far. So, and I'm not happy with the radical left. And so, if they're irritated at me, so much the better, as far as I'm concerned. So, have I conducted myself perfectly? It's like, undoubtedly no. So, I've got more than my fair share of faults, and a temper is one of them.
Step out of the link. There we go.
I'm muddling through.
All right, I'm almost a little hesitant to ask a question now, one thing I was wondering about was a lot of people, I think, would argue that kind of the values of Western civilization, free speech, the right of the individual, separation between church and state, have developed through not so much in continuous with the Judeo-Christian morality, but almost in their overthrow through such things as the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and how these values would never have come out of just simply the continuous of the Middle Ages and that Judeo-Christian morality. But my understanding of your view would be that those values are inherent in the Judeo-Christian morality, and I'm just wondering how you think
you just couldn't hook me out, eh?
The value of Judeo-Christian morality.
He's standing like right here watching me.
We ran out of bodies.
They're not rational values.
I stood there for too long.
They're deeper than rational values. I mean, it was a surprise to me.
They all bought back.
Into the past, let's say,
so
to see how deep these values
the
were.
best way, like, Shadow Team, don't even go in.
I would say that
it's fine.
Not only are they part of the
worst thing we did was let
top
push.
Story, let's say, but that they're grounded in phenomena that are
but
even
we
deeper
took
than
racks.
that.
We
But
need to
there's been
make
a fair bit of
at the worst here we buy back,
the emergence of
but
fair
not
play,
until
among animals, rats, primates, wolves, and so forth.
Like, I definitely don't think we
There's
should
an
defend here
ethos
too.
That emerges behaviorally and is then perhaps woven into narrative and then codified. That seems to be isomorphic across these different levels. And I think it's been well articulated.
I really don't think we should be fighting them, period, when we're not all up.
And that it's out of that our legal systems and institutions of rights have emerged.
Blood, if
people
you
make the case that that's a fundamental Enlightenment issue, and it was certainly the case that the rational clarity that came
forces us all to fight.
increase the degree to which that was articulated and transformed into law, but I think to attribute it to that is a great
Okay,
mistake.
so now we're on pressure to push off this. Yeah, Spirit, you take care of that. Focus the
That's 500
catapults
years
first.
ago. I'm a biologically minded guy. It's 500 years, that's nothing. 5,000 years, well, that's starting to register. 50,000 years, it's worthy of note. 6 million years, now you're getting somewhere. There's the ethic that we're discussing is way deeper than something conjured up in like 1500 by some northern Italians. So it's an articulation of a substructure that's much deeper than the articulation itself. That's what it looks like to me. Now I think there's room for intelligent debate about that.
Spirit's gonna go
But
check.
I've looked at the Enlightenment thinkers and at the deeper, at people who I regard as deeper, and I think the deeper guys, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Jung in particular, socialists to some degree.
Problem is we're pushing against high ground from Sniper.
I don't think that our rights are an Enlightenment project. They're
Not just Sniper, Drow and Wind Ranger and Invoker. Like,
that's more.
Their high ground is very difficult.
That would be particularly manifest.
Problem is I can deal with the rest. I can't deal with the Sniper.
No.
Yeah, if I can just ask kind of a related question.
Like
you
if
mentioned
I close the distance
Nietzsche
with Drow,
and,
that's no problem.
Because from what I understand, your work, you
been
seem to
a
draw from him a
contest
lot,
for
and
this
again, you
entire
seem
game.
to agree with him. So
well,
I guess,
you know,
well,
he thinks a lot of things.
Yeah, so I guess
He's probably been doing your
I'm
damnedest
wondering
to fight
where
us,
you
but
think,
she hasn't really been
because
important.
I mean, I imagine he went wrong in his interpretation of the Christian morality and how he believes, that's kind of a pernicious slave-based morality. So what exactly do you think? Because you agree with a lot of.
Well, he
other
didn't
things.
really critique Christian morality. He critiqued Christian dogma and structures. That's not exactly the same thing.
So you would agree with him then? Or?
Well, like I said, he's a complicated guy, but I think the slave morality idea, the idea that the oppressed are somehow virtuous, which I don't think is a central Christian idea, by the way. It was something that he criticized as part and parcel of what was constructed and concretized in institutional Christianity. And Nietzsche also, and this is a deeper critique, I think, Nietzsche really criticized institutional Christianity, particularly the Protestant and Catholic forms, I would say, for insufficient attention paid to the imitation of Christ and too much attention paid to the idea that the work of redemption had already been done, which is something that also divides the Orthodox Christian types from the Protestants and the Catholics, because the Orthodox types tend to tilt more towards the moral demand that you imitate Christ in your own life. And so Nietzsche's a very, you can't sum him up very easily, and I found him extraordinarily useful in training me how to think. To say that you agree with him, I don't think that you can say with someone like Nietzsche that you agree with him, because you know Nietzsche had, this is one thing that Nietzsche said that I really got a kick out of, was the most arrogant statement I've ever seen anyone make. He said, I can write in a sentence what it takes other people a book to relate. And then he said, no, what other people can't even relate to a book. And that's exactly right. Like if you read Beyond Good and Evil, for example, which is mostly aphorism, because he was a very sick man and he couldn't write for long periods of time, so he would think for long periods of time and then write down a little bomb. And Beyond Good and Evil is just sequential pieces of dynamite. And he wasn't trying to be systematic precisely. And so that's why it's not so easy to agree or disagree.
Good job. That should be a win.
You can sure let the bombs go off in your brain if you read what
It's
he has
Ricky.
to
You
say.
should be able to handle him.
And he was an interesting critic of Christianity because, you know, if you're all warped and bent and someone comes along and tells you how you're warped and bent in a manner that might enable you to straighten up, it's not obvious that you're their enemy.
Good job getting your rod off before
That
the
they're
smoke.
your enemy. And I think that's the right way to read Nietzsche with regards to Christianity. So there was plenty of rot, and that was part of what
You're
was
so low mana, you probably want to get back
causing,
after
let's say,
this.
the death of God. Now, it isn't obvious at all that Nietzsche was antithetically opposed to the founding ideas In fact, there's many places where he writes that indicate quite the contrary. So.
Thank you. So we're going to go to Alex.
Not so fast, Morty. Mega kill. It's a mega kill now.
You still really need a BKB, blood.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So I was watching a few of your interviews in preparation for this, and I heard you speak about religion quite a bit. And if you look up what religion means in the Webster Dictionary, you get something like a system of faith centered on a supernatural.
I was gonna say, why the fuck is he so fast?
But I've heard you use religion to describe things like punk rockers, for example, that's a religious
Yeah,
experience.
I got that.
So my
saw
first
the red
question
trail
would be,
coming off you.
how do you
I also
define
recognize the running
what is
animation.
considered religious? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, if, say, Sam Harris...
is what you
They're
act
trying to
out.
get us.
What's that?
Trying to get a shrine.
Religious is what you act out.
Yeah, we actually
Anything
can
you
sack
act
this
out.
shrine. It really doesn't matter. Shadow
Everything
Demon,
you
please
act
do
out
not
is-
die just for a shrine.
Is predicated on your implicit axiom.
They are already trying to
The
act on
system
you.
of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't
Let
matter
it,
whether you're atheist or not.
Yeah, do that, but don't
That's just
don't
surface.
jump for it. I don't think.
That's just surface
You
noise.
need to wait and be patient.
So it has nothing to do with divinity or
No, I didn't
supernatural
say that.
beings?
No.
Or it
Shadow
doesn't
Demon
necessarily
Man, you
have
can't
to do with
stand like anywhere in blink
No,
range.
it probably necessarily has to do with it.
'Cause
too,
now we
but
have
it
to fight a
doesn't
man down.
necessarily have anything to do with your voluntarily articulated statements about whether or not you believe in something like a transcendent deity. So, I mean, what you act out is much more what you are than what you say about yourself. And what the hell do you know about what you believe anyways? You're complicated, man.
It's a fair question.
Well, seriously, people are complicated. You know, like we're not transparent to ourselves at all. That's why we have to go to university and study psychology. It's like, you know, we're not exactly black boxes, but we are the most complicated things there are, right? And we can't even program our VCR clock. So it's like, how the hell can we propose to understand ourselves? And, you know, I'm existentially oriented, which is to say that I think that what you hold to be true is best determined as a consequence of an analysis of your actions rather than as a consequence of an analysis of what you purport to believe.
I can't see
Now,
shit.
in order to act, you can't act without a hierarchy of values. Which is the other core question you're about. You can't act without a hierarchy of values because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise?
I'll defend
So
base.
that
You
means
guys
that
go.
You're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary
Too low to
competing
progress.
hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused. That hierarchy of values has an axiomatic. It's based on axioms, and the probability that you understand them is very low because generally people don't understand their axioms. But that axiomatic system is essentially your religious system. And there's no way out of that as far as I can tell. And you can say, well, it isn't predicated on conscious belief in a transcendent deity. It's like, okay, have it your way. But, you know, most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic. And not only do they act it out, if they're treated in a manner that's not commensurate with that ethic, they get very, very, very annoyed. So, for example, if I fail to treat you as if you're an embodiment of a divine fragment, let's say, that's characterized by the ability to make free choice and to determine your own destiny in some sense, or if I fail to treat you as if you're a valued contributing member of the polity as a sovereign individual, then you'll find that very offensive and become angry. It's like, okay, then that's what you believe. Well, if I ask you if you believe any of that, well, that's a whole different story. You might give me some radical leftist nonsense. But that doesn't take away from what you. That doesn't take away from the fundamentals of your action.
As one final thing, so when you and, say, Sam Harris argue about religion, you're arguing about fundamentally different things, it sounds like. His conception of what is religious is very different from yours.
Yeah, well, he tends to think of religious religious thought the same way that a smart 13-year-old atheist thinks about a fundamentalist Christian. It's like, yeah, okay, you're just not getting to the heart of the matter. You know, and I just finished reading all of Sam's books in the last couple of weeks. And as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't ever get to the bottom of the issue. He doesn't address the fundamental thinkers. There are some profound thinkers.
I think we need to get at is killing Iraq and then backing up.
Tolstoy, Nietzsche,
instead of going
Jung,
for more
like
fighting,
they're
despite
completely
how
absent
bloodthirsty
from,
we are.
and the same with Dawkins. It's completely absent. All that conceptualization is completely absent from their corpus of works.
Which it's kind of
they
natural.
Don't even have
We've
an
taken this
understanding for the
entire
psychological
lead, as it
utility of
were,
religion.
by fighting.
And it's a big problem.
So we're naturally like, hey, I want to get more
You don't get to be
ahead.
an atheist when the people you attack are like naive fundamentalists. And I have some sympathy for the naive fundamentalists. It's like what they're basically saying is something like this. Look, we have an ethos that's valuable.
There was
you
not much we could
scientist
do about
types
it.
are casually dismantling it. What the hell are we supposed to do? Well, the fundamentalists don't know what to do about that, so they say, well,
Like we were waiting on
creationism
Spirit
is
Breaker to be
science. It's
back
like,
alive.
well, no, it's not. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a point. Their point
Shadow.
is there's something valuable here.
Be very
like,
careful where
Don't
you're
break it
standing right
casually. What are you going to replace it with?
Because they were going
The
down
new
mid, and if
atheists
they just
wish,
choose to blink
wish
up there,
that
you're
everybody
dead.
becomes rational. It's like, yeah, sure, that's going to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. I'm a student of religious studies, and currently I'm writing an honors thesis on religious
Somebody's
imagery
speaking on the left
in
side of
an
the mic.
Indo-Persian literary genre. There's a poet-philosopher who said the following, which I think you like, who, by the way, was a huge fan of Goethe. He said that in addressing God, he calls him the hidden reality, and he asks the hidden reality to reveal itself, but using the robe of metaphor, because he thinks that metaphor is the only way, stories are the only way that human beings can comprehend, you know, the hidden reality. I know you've written a lot, you speak a lot about religious stories. I just wanted to ask you, although it may be a very broad question, what is the place of the religious in stories? And
religious is something like the grammatical structure of stories. Like if you go down and you look at what makes a story, that's religion. Yeah, it's not a story otherwise. Like a story is a particular sort of thing. Like in its simplest sense, a story is an account of how to get from point A to point B. It's like a map. But there's a value structure inherent in that, obviously, because otherwise you wouldn't go from point A to point B. So just to make the map means to adopt the value structure. But the story is actually more complicated than that, because as you move from point A to point B, processes of radical transformation are often necessary. And the deep stories about the processes of radical transformation that occur as you move from point A to B are basically, they're indistinguishable from religious stories. Now, I think the reason they tend to become religious, let's say, is because it has something to do with the gap between the finite and comprehensible and the infinite and incomprehensible. It's like we live in the finite and comprehensible, but we're surrounded by the infinite and incomprehensible, and there has to be a border between those, of some, like a mediating border. That's poetry and art. That's narrative. That's religion. And it's that strange metaphorical reality, let's say, that's not factual and it's not comprehensible,
Pudge, we're gonna
but
need
that's
you
not
to
infinitely
get on that.
incomprehensible either. It's a bridge between the two. So, and as you move closer to the infinite and incomprehensible across that bridge, you get farther and farther away from what you understand, right? But how could it be otherwise, given that you're finite, you are a finite being, surrounded by infinite, what's infinite in
Bloodseeker, you might want to pick up that
And that was his
resto up
critique
top.
of the strict rationalists, that they can't, that it's hard for them to make this, that's where poets come in, and that's where artists come in. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and I learned a lot of this from Jung, because Jung's idea was that rationality is embedded in a dream. Like there's the infinite unknowable, and then there's the dream. And then inside the dream is the rational domain. And I believe that to be the case. Why else would we dream?
He still needs a BKB.
We have to dream. If we don't dream, we go insane. It doesn't take very long. And so there's an element of poetic conceptualization that grounds us. And it has to be taken seriously. You know, the rational critics of dreams think about them as random neural activity. It's like there's nothing. When you look at a TV screen that's not on a channel, that's random. When you dream something complex and sophisticated, that's not random. So, yeah.
Shadow Demon,
so
I've been telling you not to stand right where you're standing like 24 fucking times. So don't tell somebody when they're not doing what you say. Don't be a fucking hypocrite.
Take a question from here, then take one on the other end.
I think we have a right
of course.
Side of the room
Okay, sits there and mute it.
Kind of figured.
Hi, Professor. Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'd like to find out from you, what's your view of institutional racism? Is it a thing, or is it some other radical leftist agenda?
I didn't quite catch the first part.
What's your view of institutional racism, or systematic racism, as some people may call it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it a thing? Is it an actual thing? Or is it some other agenda that you might attribute to radical leftists?
It's a multivariate problem, right? Like no society is without its biases and prejudices. And some of them get built into the systems themselves. And so when you look at unequal outcomes and you're trying to discover why those unequal outcomes exist, if you have any sense, then you do a multivariate analysis and you put in prejudice and discrimination as one of the factors. One of the factors.
One of
many, many factors. And what the problem with the radical leftists is that they take the fact that societal structures are tyrannical to some degree and arbitrary, which of course they are because they're imperfect, and then they obliterate the rest of the complexity with that claim. So there's lots of reasons for inequality. Systemic bias is one of them. To what degree, it's an open question to what degree systemic bias plays in the inequality problem. But it's something that we could hypothetically address with a certain degree of detachment and intelligence. So no system is perfect. Not, and certainly not ours.
Brown, stop thinking.
Reasonable?
Please. Thank you.
Reasonable answer? Okay, that's wise.
All right, so I think it's safe to say you're a fervent critic of postmodernism, and there are times where I don't think you quite give it a fair shake. And I'm no fan of, a good amount of the literature or the theory, but if you could point to one or two of the French theorists and some of their pieces, whether it's their literature or their theory, you could point to that's culpable for this sort of cultural rot that you charge postmodernism with causing, who would it be? What would it be?
I would say Foucault and Derrida. Lacan, I would also blame if I could understand him, but I don't actually think he is understandable, so I can't blame him. So, and I've done my best to read Lacan, and I think the reason I can't read it is because it doesn't make any sense. So, because I've read some very difficult things and I could understand them. So, Foucault, I think, is a tin pot genius. I read Madness and Civilization, for example. It just seems to me to be self-evident. Psychiatric diagnostic categories are in part social construction. It's like great. We've known that since like 1960. It's just not that big a revelation. And Derrida, well, he's a trickster, and his critique of the West as phallogocentric is dead on point. Male-dominated, that's his theory, and logocentric. Well, he thinks that's a problem. Well, I don't think it's a problem. So, and I think as well, it isn't even that, and I understand the postmodernist viewpoint. Like, look, it is the case that a finite set of entities is subject to an infinite number of interpretations. Okay, that's postmodernism in a nutshell. The AI guys figured that out in from 1960 to 1992. It took them that long to wade through that fundamental technical problem, a real problem. The problem of perception, for example. It's been very hard to solve the AI problem of perception because there are a lot of ways to look at the world. Like the objects aren't just there in any simple sense. So okay, there's an infinite number of interpretations. No problem. There's not an infinite number of viable interpretations. Okay, That's a big problem. Okay, and a little bit of thinking through that would have gone a long ways for the postmodernists. So that's number one. And then, what's the other one? Oh yes, and then the other problem is, okay, there's an infinite number of interpretations. We won't make anyone canonical. All right, well then how the hell are you going to act? Because you have to make a value system canonical if you're going to act. Oh, well, we didn't solve that problem. How about we just slip Marxism in underneath the carpet and not notice the problem? Then that gives us something to do. It's like people come out and criticize me and say, Dr. Peterson doesn't understand that postmodernism and Marxism are incommensurate. It's like, yeah, actually, I do understand that. But the postmodern neo-Marxists don't seem to understand that. So how can you be a postmodernist and a Marxist at the same time? Well, the answer to that is actually to be found in the historical data. The postmodernist types, like Foucault and Derrida, were Marxists before they became postmodernists. And the postmodern overlay on the Marxism was, as far as I can tell, mostly a cover story for going about the same old murderous idiocy under a new guise. So,
do you think it's possible that there are, I'm sorry? That there are lenses, like postmodern lenses, that we can view culture from under, that can at times be more powerful and useful than other lenses. Like, for example, Baudrillard, the idea of the simulacrum and the successive phases of the image. Joan Didion.
Baudrillard could at least think. And I mean, you can't throw all the postmodernists into the same jug, you know, but I would say it's still Derrida and Foucault have had the most pernicious effects. Well, the problem is they didn't deal with it seriously. It's like you can't just say no meta-narrative. It's like, okay, how are we going to unite ourselves then? We're going to use multiculturalism. Well, that's really worked to produce a peaceful world, hasn't it? So you need a uniting narrative. If we didn't have a uniting narrative, we wouldn't all be sitting peacefully in this room. It's the uniting narrative that governs our behavior in this room. And look, here we are, all peaceful. It's like they're not dealing with the fundamental issues. And to slip Marxism back in as a backdoor route to having something to do with your life is intellectually and morally reprehensible.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
How are you, sir? My name's Steve. I just wanted to ask you about this experience that I had after watching one of your lectures that really profoundly impacted me, and I was wondering if you could kind of help me out with understanding this. After watching your lecture on Jung and just talking about his life, you started talking about the Lion King and kind of connecting what the intro scene was in the Lion King and the idea of archetypes. And when I started to understand what you were saying, I had this unbelievable feeling, like in my stomach and my whole body. It's just this smack, like this very intense feeling.
So warning, never to read Jung.
Yeah, well, I have. I started with Ion, so that's
maybe
not a good idea. So
no.
Yeah. It was just this powerful feeling, and I got so emotional, and thinking up how to articulate this question to you a few minutes ago, I was just getting so emotional. It just seems like, it scared the hell out of me, that feeling. But it was also a really meaningful, so valuable, amazing feeling. And I thought, it's kind of like what God is, or yeah, it was just so. And I usually get that feeling too of after listening to like a band like the Cro-Mags or Black Flag, or some hardcore band. That music is so important to me like that, and
it's levels of reality stacking on top of each other.
And it just the question that just made me so emotional too is like, what could my life be? And that was something that I
but
just
what
found
is the
myself
question
asking
you want
myself,
to ask him?
Just what
this guy likes to hear the sound of his own voice too damn much.
Some extra stuff on that, what that really was,
Yeah, well, you gotta be very careful when you're doing something like reading Jung, because he'll reorganize your cognitive structures.
That's the best thing he's going to be able to offer.
There's deaths and rebirths that go along with that. There's what you're trying to do in part is to, in a sense, you're trying to bring what you do and how you imagine yourself and how you articulate yourself into alignment. So those three things are the same. It's very hard because there's more to you in your action than there is in your articulation, and there's more to you in your action than there is in your imagination. And so partly what you're experiencing is an expanded sense of self and possibility.
I think I'll actually
and you
call
might
it
think,
here.
well, that's a wonderful thing, but it's also a very daunting thing.
We'll end it there. I'll probably add this to my watch later. Come on. YouTube, work. There we go.